The Rune Smith. Chapter 121 Rare and Shiny. Roland glanced at the inside of the strangely lit up room. In it, he spotted a ruby variant of the volcanic salamander as well as some other monsters. How many enemies? Robert asked while getting ready for some monster slaying. There are 6. I saw 2 of those scolopendra crawlers around. Roland explained to his impromptu party. His detection device showed 6 monsters hiding in the open cavern. He took a peek outside to see the closest monster nearby. To his surprise, it was a rare variant of the volcanic salamander. The rest were creepy insect types that were even crawling on the ceiling. "Sir Robert, can you be the vanguard?" Roland asked while Robert nodded without even complaining. He feared that he would have a repeat of what happened during the bandit attack all those years ago. This wasn't the first noble lady in her knight that he was teaming up with. Robert didn't seem overprotective of Lady Lucille, it seemed that he had some trust in her magical abilities. "I'll be right behind you then, and Lady Lucille, give us some ranged support if you can." "Leave it to me, Sir Wayland." "Stay safe, Lady Lucille, if something happens just run." Robert turned to the ice mage. The woman just nodded while also replying. "Don't worry, Sir Robert, I'll be fine, Sir Wayland's tamed beast will protect me." Agni moved his snout up high, it was as if he was saying, "Leave it up to me." This ruby wolf was the weakest member of the party, but he could at least stall some of the monsters. This could give Lucille precious time to finish an incantation and land a finishing blow. The plan was to use ranged attacks. Robert was the only person who lacked those capabilities. He was tasked to keep the monsters from getting past him while Roland and Lucille pelted them with spells. "Everyone ready?" Lucille and Robert nodded at Roland's question and they entered the strangely lit cavern. It was of moderate size with about 100 meters in length with 50 in width. The ceiling was quite high, over 10 meters. The layout was also quite peculiar as there were many glowing gemstones everywhere. Even before entering, Roland and Lucille could feel the mana concentration spike. The light was coming from these crystals that hang down from the ceiling like stalactites. There were small holes in the walls with enough size for the centipede and slug-like monsters to crawl from. Along with them, there was also one pool of lava in the middle, probably through which the ruby salamander came through. "Mana, source of all power, heed my call." The battle started with Lucille beginning her incantation. She was quite speedy with her words, much faster than Roland ever was when he was still training his mage craft. Even with that, Roland only needed to raise his magical rod to produce a burst of cold energy. This was a spell called Icicle Rain. It created many small sharp icicles that would fly in a burst of cold air in a wide area. These creatures would all lose some of their bodily functions when exposed to freezing temperatures. The best way to do this was with an area of effect spell. The open cavern had a small lava pool in the middle which would make this process more difficult. It was also closed off from most sides and the area was limited, which gave this strategy some validity. Roland kept spraying cold air and icicles in all directions while Robert guarded him. Lady Lucille managed to finish her incantation. The spell she used sprayed cold energy along with snow in all directions. Cone of cold. The monsters that were here were a bit slow to react as the party of adventurers was not aiming at them directly. The red scolopendra crawlers started wiggling around as they felt the shift in temperature. By instinct, they started to back away from the source of this cold energy. 2 slug-like creatures that were hanging on some of the stalactites started compressing into themselves while falling down. The ruby salamander reacted as well, but instead of attacking it started retreating away towards the nearby lava pool. "No, you don't." Roland quickly reacted by sending an ice arrow towards the fleeing monster. It could not escape them, it was far too valuable and needed to be stopped before it could flee. The ice arrow connected with the creature's leg, it went right through those red gems while freezing the entire leg in place. Roland's high intelligence stat, paired with his high-grade rune weapons, was not something that a creature of this level could hope to resist. The ruby salamander gave out a maddened shout while turning its head towards the person that injured it. It opened its mouth wide, soon a wide-range flaming attack was produced and headed right towards its attacker. This was the moment that Robert was waiting for. With his shield forward he jumped between Roland and the salamander's flame breath. The runic shield that was given to him produced a blue light. The blue light began glowing brighter before expanding outwardly into a frozen block of ice. This block of ice took the form of the kite shield with which the flame breath collided with. The runic shield kept radiating cold, which successfully doused the flames without letting any heat pass. Roland used this chance to take aim once more, this time blasting the ruby salamander with more freezing arrows. The monster's body was soon covered in icicles and it stopped moving altogether. Knowing magic sure is handy. He looked around the now frosted-over cavern. The other insect monsters weren't looking so great after he and Lucille lowered the temperature in this room. He could even see Robert shivering from the cold. The rest of the battle was quite uneventful as they went around and finished the paralyzed monsters off. Think that was all of them? Let me check. Before pulling out his detection device he took some time to look around. It didn't seem that there were any more hidden enemies around now, and that was soon confirmed with the help of his magical item. Thanks to the pool of lava in the middle, the ice began to quickly melt. Even with that, it would take some time, and thanks to this the party of 3 and a pup could cool down. What is this place? Lucille commented after stepping into the cavern. Robert was quick to come over in fear of any monsters popping up. The mana in here is strange. Those crystals, are they Eloquence crystals? Both Roland and Lucille could feel that large quantities of mana radiating from some of the glowing gems in this cavern. They seemed to be crystallized forms of the mana fluid used to power magical items. There were quite a few of them in this cavern and would probably be worth a lot of gold. Roland leaned down to grasp one of these crystals. They looked like blue gems but were much softer. When applying too much force they would break easily and even turn to liquid when used as fuel after a while. From what Roland knew, the harder the crystal the more mana could be stored in it. I could probably stick one of these into a golem. Wonder how long it would last. Golems, just like any other magical item, required a power source. This would be either something like Eloquence fluid or a magician using their own mana. Roland was trying to develop his own batteries that would use his old world knowledge, but this would work just as well. This wasn't all there was to this cave. After some of the frost had melted he spotted some other strange-looking rocks. One of them was quite red and had some metallic luster to it. Could this be? He spoke out without noticing, which brought the attention of his 2 noble companions. They saw him taking out his rune-smithing hammer along with a chisel. Did you find something, sir? Wayland? Lucille asked, but didn't get much of an answer as Roland was busy hammering a spot in the ground. After a moment they saw him pulling out some kind of reddish rock. What is that, sir? Wayland. Oh, excuse me. Roland was finally able to snap out of his trance. He was somewhat shocked that he managed to find something like this here. If I'm not mistaken, this is red mithril. Red mithril. Lucille, who was interested in magical items and also runes, was aware of the qualities of this ore. Robert, on the other hand, looked at the shiny rock. He was aware of the regular silver variant of this ore but had not heard of the red one. Yes, it has the same qualities to usual mithril, but due to absorbing fire elemental mana for many generations it is also fully fire resistant. Roland explained while looking at the rock. There was more of it here. If he managed to fashion his entire armor out of this metal he would probably be able to even dive in the lava pools. The metal fully blocked any heat from going past it. It was also lighter than deep steel. What some craftsmen did was to graft thinner sheets of this metal over other heavier alloys. Even a thin layer of this metal would be more resistant to cutting than a thick deep steel one. It was done this way as mithril was quite rare and a thin armor made from it would still bend a lot. Thus it needed to be placed over something that would keep its form in place. Due to this, quite a few craftsmen used the brigandine design to go with this fantasy metal. Then there were some other metals it could be mixed with to get a good result. Wait, isn't that? A sound of a rock hitting the ground echoed through this cavern as Roland saw something in the distance. He quickly ran up to the wall with some more. there he saw a blue-grayish ore that was next to one of the mana crystals. The two minerals were somewhat interacting with each other, which brought it to his attention. This might be Ethereum. Ethereum? The metal they use for making magic tower cores. Lucille was quick to follow after Roland. Robert did the same. While the two magicians continued to talk about magical items, he was busy keeping an eye out for monsters. The same, its magical absorbing properties are paramount. The runes on it will very rarely deteriorate. Even though this metal wasn't all that resistant and soft, it was still something runesmiths craved. It could be mixed with all the various minerals to produce the best runic or enchanted gear. With an Ethereum alloy mixture, the runic structures even up to tier 3 would almost never deteriorate. Roland took out his hammer and chisel and started to hit the walls like a madman. His rush to get the metal was halted by a hand that belonged to Robert. "Hey! You are making too much noise, what if the monsters hear us?" He was snapped back to reality by his older brother. The sight of a precious metal that could help him create superior weapons and armor made him forget about the situation they were in. Even though this was a treasure trove filled with precious metals and magic crystals, they were useless to him if he couldn't use them. I'm sorry." Roland placed the hammer and chisel back into his spatial bag before stepping away from the rocky wall. There were other various metals that he couldn't identify just yet, but they would need to wait. First, they needed to get out of here. If there was no way connecting to the rest of the dungeon, then he would not be able to use these ores anyway. Right, we should see if we have really cleared this chamber. Let us stay close together, try not to touch any strange things. We are still in a dungeon, there could be traps. Agni, go check. Roland called Agni over, that at this point had gained some detection skills. With them, he could at least point them to any regular traps and even magical ones, as he did possess the mana sense skill. The group started to slowly move around the cave once more, this time looking at the walls more thoroughly. I was sure that there was a passage somewhere. Roland remembered seeing a larger tunnel leading out of this section of the cavern when looking at his detection device. It was able to show a small minimap-like area in holographic form. After coming in here, he couldn't see any paths leading out. There were some smaller holes in the walls of the ceiling, but not large enough for them to crawl through. Some of those bug-like monsters must have gotten in through those while the salamanders swam in through the pool. No one of them could swim out through this lava to see where it came out, not even Agni that had the highest fire resistance here. After going around a few times, they didn't find anything out of the ordinary. There were no traps or any more monsters here. The cavern was still filled with magic crystals and rare metals that were waiting to be mined. This was something that he was very much interested in, but first, he needed to survive. Roland took out his orb and injected some of the mana into it. The holographic map showed up, but it was flickering on and off as if there was something interfering with it. Strange. During the flickering, he saw something that looked like a path, but that spot was blocked by a wall. "Did you find something, Sir Wayland?" Lucille commented while Robert also chimed in. "I don't see anything here." Roland looked at this wall as he moved closer. He remembered that there were many paths that he could open thanks to his debugging skill, thus he activated it. Jackpot! He saw a familiar runic structure like in all the other secret rooms that he discovered. Thus he leaned up and injected some of his mana into this structure to make it move. "Hey!" Robert jumped back with the shield raised as he heard the wall rumbling. Soon a small opening appeared, just large enough for someone of Roland's size to go through it. After removing his hand, the opening closed up once more and he took a step back. "Sir Wayland! This is a dungeon, there are similar hidden paths scattered around. Luckily I know the way of opening them." He didn't really want to disclose that they were based on runes. If word got out, other runesmiths might be commissioned to open these hidden treasure troves. This one, for instance, he would like to keep for himself. The metal ores would be a big help for his future creations. "Oh? How did you do it? Are there runes involved?" I think we should do something about our food shortage." It seemed that the girl was fast on the uptake, so he tried to shift the conversation in another direction. He turned around and started walking towards the dead monster. The salamander? Robert asked while looking at the partially frozen monster. Yes, its meat is edible, we can roast it at the lava pool. His party had already tried eating the volcanic salamander variant. This one would not taste much different, they just needed to remove the outer shell to get to the juicy meat inside. You expect the lady to eat monster meat? Are you mad? Robert looked at the killed ruby salamander that was in the process of being sniffed by Agni. The lady in question looked at the dead monster and backed away while holding her hand over her mouth. It seemed that neither of his two new companions were too keen on eating this dead salamander. Do you have any better ideas? My rations won't last us more than a few days and we could be stuck here for weeks. Without waiting for a reply, Roland moved over to the partially frozen monster. He was not a specialist at cooking or dismembering monsters for parts. Bernier mostly took care of that part, but he had seen him and others do it. It would be a bit troublesome, but he knew how to prepare the meat. If Sir Wayland thinks so, maybe we should consider it. But what if you get sick? What if that meat is poisonous? Robert replied while looking at Roland that was now busy cutting up the monster carcass. While listening to the conversation, he turned to his older brother. Didn't you learn about this at your night school? Monster meat is edible, unless it's a poisonous type it's mostly safe. It didn't seem like these noble types were taught any real-life survival skills for these types of situations. The lady here was stuck with her nose deep in books while the knight was mostly interested in swinging his sword. It seemed that they only focused on the things that their classes were good at and weren't interested in much beyond that. I'll try it first if you are afraid we need to take the meat with us. This will be a good place to take a break before we move. There is only one way out and it's blocked. There were two passages leading into this cavern. One through they came in and the other the one locked behind a runic lock. There were still the smaller openings through which the monsters could crawl in and the lava pool. He and Robert would need to keep watch while the lady rested. She looked quite tired, her vitality being drained during the walk and fight. Chapter 122 Second Home Invasion. The sounds of hammering metal were heard in the dim-lit room. Each time the hammer descended on the heated steel plate it produced more sparks that brightened this workshop. Bernier was at it again, this time around he had moved up to the upper body part. He used his tongs to place the piece of metal into the runic forge. Thanks to the whole thing being run on electricity he didn't need to worry about blowing any wind into this forge with the bellows. Instead, there was a little crank on the side that when wound up in the right direction would make the forge produce heat. He had no idea how this tool really worked as his boss was quite cryptic about it. It didn't matter as the important part was that it made crafting items a lot easier. He continued striking the metal frequently and consistently until he got it in a somewhat rounder shape. He was aiming to craft the cuirass portion today, at least the front side before the day ended. The whole process was sped up thanks to some of the machines that Roland had left behind. Before he needed to mold everything into shape with his hammer, but now things like drilling holes, quick sharpening, or even cutting were possible. It was now quite easy for him to create the desired shape from the diagram. Then drill some holes through which he could rivet the parts to each other. The most bothersome parts were still the areas for the mana stones. These grooves needed to fit the mana stones just right, otherwise, they could either fall out or be crushed during combat. After most of the day had passed, Bernier was left with a deep steel armor part. It was the breastplate this time around. What was left was giving it a nice shining before attempting the creation of the rear plate. When both parts were connected they would form the full deep steel cuirass. Good intermediate grade. Bernier used the identifying monocle on the piece of armor before putting it to the side. With this, he would have the lower portion along with the chest almost done. Then came the arms, shoulders, and the last would be the helmet. He didn't bother with putting any intricate designs on this armor. After it was put through rune crafting it would already be quite stylish. With the addition of mana crystals, it would look even better. This would also add to the all-around cost. I hope the boss will like it. Bernier yawned out while putting the piece of armor on an armor rack. Together with all the other pieces, he had made it was looking fine. Was it supposed to be 3 weeks? Or 4? Bernier had been busy working, but that didn't mean that he liked living here alone. Without his boss's frowny face it didn't seem right. He hoped that he would return soon. He was very much interested in all the runic contraptions that he made and how he could aid in their creations. For him, a proper dwarven craftsman, it was quite an honor to work on the costly magical equipment. His boss also had a knack for it. He was able to come up with various items that always blew Bernier away. He was looking at one of them just now. It had a spherical shape and was up on a thin stand. On the stand was a little indent for his thumb. When he injected some of his mana, a bright green illusion would appear. It depicted the whole workshop and he could even see the tunnels around it. This never gets old, let me see. Bernier had lived mostly a mundane life, thus a magical item like this was quite a novelty. His boss even told him to use it often as it detected if there were any people or monsters nearby. After a minute of glancing at this light show, he removed his thumb. It was time to go up, get cleaned, and have one last drink before going to bed. At least that was the plan, but before he could go out he heard a whistling sound. What the? It was followed by a red light going up in the corner of the workshop. This was something that his boss had warned him about. He quickly moved back to the detection device and turned it back on. The red light and whistling meant that something was amiss. This was an alarm feature and would only activate if someone was close to the property. Blue dots, there were 4 of them and they were all close to each other. Roland had given him an explanation about the various colors. Red would be monsters, green would be regular animals, and then there was blue, people from the many races. They are close by, maybe an adventurer party just looking around. This workshop was close to the city and between the dungeon. From time to time adventurers did come through here. Some of them even hunted the animals in the forest as well as the lesser monsters. But why would they still be here at this hour? It was quite late, close to midnight. Everything had gone dark and there was no light outside. The city was bright from the outside, so it was easy to spot, but this house was not. He was sure to put out any lights when going down into the workshop so as to not waste any electricity that could go into the runic tools. He started to sweat. Memories of the party of thugs that ambushed him in the forest started coming back to him. The moment of weakness passed soon as he managed to snap back to reality. No, this time it won't be the same. Bernier looked to the wall, on it a somewhat strange-looking tube with a large gun chamber attached to it. To the side, there was also a vest with pockets, in them quite the assortment of various colored spheres. After recovering, his gaze moved back to the lit-up hologram. The 4 blue dots were still in one place. Before acting he needed to make sure that they were actually enemies and not some passers-by. Is everyone ready? One of the hooded men called out. All of them were here for one thing, and that was to get rich. They knew that the problematic owner of this house had left on a dungeon expedition. It would take at least another week for him to return, which would give them enough time to skip town. Yes. The other 3 thieves nodded while the boss looked to the large wall. This house was a bit strange. The bottom part was hardwood, but there was a metallic fence with barbed wire above it. Remember, it's only one blacksmith. He should not pose a threat. Kill him on sight. The group had been looking at this area for a whole week and came prepared with a plan. They knew about the only resident inside and were aware that he would pose no threat to them. All of them were tier 2 rogues, with their boss being at the highest level. Let's go. They all nodded at each other and silently moved towards the fenced-off home. They moved in from the back, going all together. There was something strange about this fence, thus they knew that it would be best to evade it. One of the hooded men stopped and moved his hands together. With his help, the other 3 were able to easily vault over this barbed wire without even touching it once. The 4th, on the other hand, had to take on a running start to barely jump off the fence. He almost touched one of those metallic barbs and felt a strange sensation wash over his body as he was passing by. Wait, we need to be careful. The group knew that there was something strange with this whole house. One of the thieves that was versed in traps crouched down while activating his skill. From the outside they could not tell that there were any traps, but when being so close by it was easy to notice. The ground has been dug up. He did not know what was buried there, but he knew that there was something. There were various possibilities here. Traps came in various shapes and sizes. This being a Runesmith's home, they speculated that they were magical in nature. Instead of trying to disarm them, it was better to just evade setting them off. Use that item to be sure. One of the men took out something that looked like a pocket watch. After injecting some of his mana into it, the item reacted. It sent out a dim blue light that when making contact with the traps illuminated them in red color. It's working, let us continue. They used this item to show them the way. There were quite a large amount of these traps. The sheer number made them think that there was something good waiting for them inside of that home. No one would bother to place so many if there were no treasures inside to plunder. It seemed like they would make it. They were already halfway into the backyard before something happened. Suddenly the boss of the thieves heard a strange noise. He glanced up and thanks to his night vision skill he could see some kind of small orb. This was his first mistake. This orb suddenly burst into a bright light, blinding him along with his party of 3. What? The whole place was illuminated by this golf ball-sized orb. Thanks to it, the group of 4 was clearly visible even during this pitch-dark night. There you are! They heard a voice coming. Instead of from the main house, it seemed to be coming from a different location, this being the log cabin to the side. They all turned to see who it was. Being still blinded, they could vaguely see a blurry person. This person was holding something in his hand that looked like a tube with a handle on it. Take this! A sound of pressurized air was heard as something was launched towards the group of stunned thieves. The boss, even when in distress, kept his cool. He knew that there were still traps all over this place, so he quickly backtracked through the path that he had already taken. This left his party members open to the incoming attack. They saw another sphere traveling towards them, but before they could react, it collided with the ground next to them. Instantly it turned into a large ball of flames. The closest person to it was thrown to the side, his dark robe catching on fire. This wasn't quite over, as when he tumbled he collided with one of the many traps on the ground. This produced another large explosion that caused him to instantly die on the spot. You think you can come here and rob us? The voice of an angry half-dwarf echoed through the area and was followed by many explosions. Due to the chaotic nature of his attack, the thieves had a hard time reacting. Nuak! Even without the glowing orb of light above them, the whole place was well lit up by the explosions. The thief boss was the only one fast enough to evade the initial bombardment and was also able to recover from the blinding effect. What he saw was his maimed party members. One looked dead while the other had his legs blown off, the third one was curled up while missing an arm. It was clear that this was a bad idea, but he was still alive. He looked in the direction of the man that caused this, a slightly larger dwarf that lived here. The thief boss could see him pointing a strange rod at him. It flung something his way that was round in shape. He was ready this time around and reacted accordingly. Having superior agility, he quickly stepped to the side while also being careful of where he stepped in. This flung sphere collided somewhere close to where he used to stand. Instead of exploding into a ball of fire as he expected, it sprayed some kind of liquid all over the place. The pressure was so high that it got onto his own clothes. His party members were unable to react at all as they were quite immobilized. Wait, is this? He quickly removed his robe and threw it to the side before hearing another orb being fired off. The moment it collided with the ground, it produced a fireball. This ball of fire, when coming in contact with the liquid, lit it up even more. The 3 party members that were already injured started burning up as everything went up in flames. The liquid was flammable oil that when coming in contact with the flames continued to burn everything in a set radius. The thief boss looked into the distance. He could see the man that killed his men standing there. There wasn't much distance between the two, but he was unsure of that weapon he was holding. It decimated his party of Tier 2 rogues in a matter of moments. Then an opportunity arose. He could see the half-dwarf opening this strange weapon up, in his hands some orbs that were previously flung at him and his party. It looked that this was some kind of archer-like weapon and he needed to reload. The old thief boss made a decision. He charged towards his opponent. He could see him fumbling around during reloading. The old thief was unwilling to leave without getting something in return. He lost all his men and would need to find a new party, but that would require funds. These he could receive by killing this half-dwarf and selling that weapon that he had. During the initial blast, quite a bit of the traps had been activated. He now had a path towards his enemy. In both of his hands, he was holding sharp daggers. The half-dwarf managed to insert the ammunition in. His hand went to the crank on the side, but before he could use it, the thief boss threw one of his daggers. Ah! The thrown dagger embedded itself in Bernier's shoulder and brought him tumbling down to the ground. The thief grinned as he saw his enemy lose his weapon. He had aimed for the arm that was holding the weapon in place and was successful. Now, what remained was to get closer and go for the throat. He could see the half-dwarf going for something on his vest and he judged it to be some sidearm. Nothing that he couldn't handle, so he prepared for it as he jumped in for the kill. His sharp knife went towards Bernier's uninjured hand while he on the other hand held an item out. Hey! The thief expected it to be some kind of bladed weapon, like a dagger or knife. Instead, he saw a small card-sized parchment with some strange runic symbols on it. It was now too late. The tip of his dagger collided with the runic writing, but the item was already activated. Arghhhhh. A flash of electricity erupted from this small card, causing the thief to stop. The man could feel a massive amount of lightning energy going through his body as he was affected by the spell. His skin started melting as he was flung back. Why, you bastard! He was still alive, but his body was numb. This was due to being hit directly by a Tier 2 electric spell that came out of that small runic card. I'm going to kill you, then I'll kill your family. The man started shouting at Bernier while not being able to get off the ground. He knew what was about to happen. Rage took him over as he still couldn't believe that he was done in by a blacksmith. Go to hell! Bernier fired off one last grenade towards the remaining assailant. It caused another explosion that made quick work of this thief. Ha! The victor was now clear. The 4 home invaders were left devastated in the yard. Their body parts were scattered in various places and some were even burning up. Bernier could barely stand up while having a dagger stuck in his shoulder. This is going to take a while to clean up. He chuckled to himself weakly while also looking at the dead bodies. He started to become nauseous. The body parts were everywhere and this was the first time that he killed a person himself. Before barfing all over the place, he quickly turned around. I need to get a health potion. Bernier waddled over to the log cabin while trying not to pass out. This dagger had lowered his health pool by a third and he was losing more due to the bleeding status. The attack was over, but he needed medical aid, after which he would need to douse the fire and take care of the bodies. The night was not quite over, but he had been victorious. He didn't come out unscathed, but he managed to protect his new home. I did it, boss. Ugh, this hurts. How do those adventurer types do this? He mumbled while disappearing into the cabin. Before pulling out the dagger, he needed to make sure that he had some healing potions to douse on this deep wound. Chapter 123 Long Corridors. The party of 3 and a wolf rested for the night. Roland's sleep resistance skill had been maxed out after pulling so many all-nighters, and after he reached his Tier 2 class, it evolved. Now it was called sleep immunity, and he would be able to function for up to a week without needing to sleep. Due to the nature of this predicament, he chose to remain on guard. The lava pool in the middle of the cave was dangerous as more of the volcanic salamanders could appear out of it. Then there were the smaller holes in the walls through which the centipede-looking monsters and slugs came out. They had no tents, so sleeping would be hard, mostly for the noble lady, as she was clearly not used to extreme conditions like this. It was quite stuffy to begin with, but the lava pool only made things worse. Luckily for Robert and Lucille, they had a craftsman with them. There were also many various metallic ores in this place, along with crystallized mana-giving fluid that could be used as fuel. Lucille still had the plate that she used to control ice with some modification Roland was able to use the crystals to power it. Thanks to this, an area with purified air was established and they could rest. Lucille could barely sleep in Roland's backup sleeping bag that didn't really add much softness to the hard ground. Roland on the other hand continued to examine the cavern. Besides mithril and etherium, he managed to find various other metals and minerals. Some could be sold off to the Alchemist Guild while others he could use directly for his own wares. He did not have a pickaxe nor much space in his traveling bag. It pained him to leave all of these resources behind, but they needed to move. The longer they stayed here, the more danger they would find themselves in. With his hammer and chisel he managed to snag a couple of the rarer materials, but if he could return here alone remained to be seen. He would need to convince these two nobles to not mention this cave when they got back. Then he would also need to be able to return here in one piece. Going down the chasm would be quite hard unless he brought some climbing specialist along. The slug-like creature collapsed after being frozen by an ice arrow. The monsters continued to appear after intervals, which meant that this place was not safe to stay. It was time to leave. The edible monster salamander had been gutted and the meat had been roasted over the lava pool already. "Where do you think this will lead us to, sir?" "Wayland?" Lucille asked while Roland opened up the secret passage. "I don't know, but it could be a way out. Some dungeons like this have secret passages. They mostly take you to a treasure or are a shortcut to other sections of the dungeon. It could even lead us to where our companions are staying. This place was already a trove of treasures. These many magical crystals and precious metals would make even Tier 3 class holders salivate." Roland hoped that this passage would take them back outside into the main dungeon area. "Fascinating." Lucille's eyes sparkled with naive wonder. The girl was still quite chipper and didn't realize that they could very well be walking into a trap. "Are you sure that it's safe? Wouldn't it be better to wait for Lord Percival to organize a rescue?" Robert on the other hand kept a cooler head. Even though they were stuck here, it might have still been safer than to venture into the unknown. Roland turned to the two people here. He wanted to move into the secret passage. He did not want to put his faith in other people too much. "You have two choices: either you can stay here and wait, or you can come with me. I won't force you. I will go in alone if I have to." He had already made his decision. He would go explore all the possibilities. These two could wait here if they wanted. The monsters weren't that strong, and with Lucille's ice magic they would go down rather fast. "You intend to go in without us?" Robert looked a bit surprised by Roland's proclamation. Apparently, he still thought that Roland was working for them and was obligated to listen to their orders. Unbeknownst to them, this was not what was written on the contract that he signed. There was no clause specifically forcing him to take orders from the nobles. He was there more as a support than a defender or a fighter. "Yes, the volcanic salamander meat should last you for some time. Lady Lucille also seems to know water magic. You won't even need my water bottle. You can remain here if you deem it too dangerous." "Remain here?" Robert turned his head towards the cavern that they rested in for one night. After thinking for a moment, the brother turned to the blue-haired lady that when their eyes met just smiled. "Isn't it fine? My lady. I think we can trust Sir Wayland." "Ah, if the lady says so." Robert awkwardly turned towards Roland and his face instantly became stern. He nodded to indicate that they were ready to move. "Agni." The ruby wolf wagged his tail around while turning on the light-giving gem on his forehead. After activating the runes, the passage opened up and all of them quickly squeezed inside. The door soon closed behind them. It was time to move on. "Not much space in here, I'll lead the way." The corridor was about 2 meters in width and 3 meters in height. It was wide enough for Roland and Agni to go in the front while Robert remained at Lucille's side. Just like before, there was no light anywhere. Without Agni, the two people behind him would have a tough time moving around. Roland, thanks to his helmet, was able to see clearly, but the path was long and winding. They continued walking and it took them quite a bit to finally reach a fork in the road. Two paths stood before them. "Which should we take?" asked Robert while Roland took out his mapping device. Regretfully, it had limited range and only showed more winding corridors that somewhat intertwined with each other. It was hard to make out where they were going. I don't see any traps, no runes either. Agni moved forward as well. He used his wolf nose to sniff for potential clues, but he also came out short. With a whine, he looked up to Roland that just patted him on the head. We'll have to depend on luck with this one, Roland said while looking at Lucille and Robert. He knew that his own luck stat was abysmal. It would be better if one of them chose. How about you decide? He pointed to Robert as he wasn't sure how Lucille's luck stat looked and Robert's was above his by some points. How about we go right? Roland nodded, but before heading inside he moved his finger towards the wall. From his fingertip, a slight blue hue escaped that crafted a runic symbol above the path they were entering. Sir Wayland. Just marking the way. I hope that I'm just being paranoid, but it will help us if this is what I think it is. They continued forward, and as Roland had presumed, they came across another fork in the road. After putting a symbol above the path that they took, they ventured forward into a corridor that one of the noble youths pointed them in. 10 minutes turned to 30, then to an hour as they continued walking into multiple paths. Then finally they came to a path that they had traveled through before. The symbol above the pathway was clear. This is the first path that we entered through, then that path would lead us back to the chamber with the mana crystals. Oh, is that why, sir? Wayland put those symbols above the pathways. Lucille clapped her hands as she finally figured out what Roland intended with the markings. Thanks to his good memory, he would be able to remember which path they had already tried. They started to retrace their steps. Now they entered the unmarked passages to see if they guided them to an area that they weren't in before. With the help of this trick and Roland's good internal mapping skills, they finally reached a larger cavern. This one looks different than the rest. The entrance they were looking at was different by having 2 lit torches on the sides. It was clear that this was the exit from this mini labyrinth that took them a few good hours to go through. Sir Wayland, is that a door? Could it be the exit from this place? We should be careful, it could be a trap. Roland replied while activating his debugging skill, but there was nothing out of the ordinary on this door. He couldn't feel anything magical on it either. After scanning the surroundings with his map once more, he could only see a long straight corridor. Agni, can you smell or sense anything? He asked his tamed monster as he was the only person with trap detection and tracking skills in this party. Lucille regretfully also didn't know any trap detection skills, so she wouldn't be of much use. Agni perked up and started sniffing while moving closer to the door. The 3 humans followed slowly after the ruby wolf, but it didn't seem like there was anything out of the ordinary. Okay, I'll open it, stay vigilant. Robert and Lucille nodded while Roland grabbed the door handle. He pushed the door open, and just like his magic item showed, it was a long wide corridor. Why are there so many tiles? Lucille asked after peeking over Roland's shoulder. The room was quite well lit with torches on the walls. The peculiar thing about this corridor was the floor. It looked out of place as it was composed of symmetrical square tiles. They had various designs on them. Some had pictures of monsters while others of people. I can feel the mana, it's concentrated on the ground. Roland nodded at Lucille as he could feel it too. The whole floor was magical in nature. From what he could tell, it was dangerous to move forward. This was probably some kind of puzzle that they needed to go through. If they stepped on the wrong square tile, something deadly could occur. Let me see. After activating his debugging skill, a little smirk crept onto his face. He could see it. Beneath those drawings there were runic structures. After getting a good look at them, he took out a small rock from the outside. Step back for a moment. He threw it on one of the tiles, and the moment the rock connected with the ground, a burst of heated energy shot up. Robert took a step back as he saw the column of fire reach all the way up to the ceiling. It was clear that whoever stepped into that trap would be roasted alive. Magical traps, fascinating, and so many of them. Did someone create them in this dungeon? The girl raised a good question as to how the traps in the dungeon appeared was unknown. No one knew if the dungeon core somehow created these here or if they were created by some other being entirely. If we take the wrong step we will activate the traps and die. How is anyone supposed to reach the other side? Robert asked. Probably in another section of the dungeon there is some sort of map that guides you through this place or some kind of riddle. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary. To get past traps like these you sometimes needed to solve a riddle, find something that guided you through it, or have someone versed in these contraptions in the party. Luckily for the two, Roland could do this. Roland went down to his knees and looked at the first square tile. On it was a drawing of a dragon along with some runes. His fingers glowed with magical energy as he touched it. This task was not hard for a runesmith like him. He only needed to disable the runic structure to make the whole trap useless. If this was something like a pressure plate trap then he would be unable to do anything. Luckily it was magical in nature. Sir. Wayland, how did you do that? These runic traps, it's easy to disable them if you know runesmithing. He replied to the curious noble lady while moving forward slowly. I'll disable the traps now. This long and also wide corridor was covered in square tiles. Even with his large mana pool and high skill levels, it was hard to disable these many traps at once. His armor was also not made for crouching, but after about an hour they were through the corridor as he disabled the path in the middle. If I ever return here I could reactivate them. Roland wanted to return here later as he was leaving a lot of precious metals behind. What better way to keep the secret stash hidden than leaving some traps behind? He could customize the traps so that no one could disable them, rendering this room a death trap for anyone that wasn't a runesmith. The designs of these runic traps were also different from the ones that he knew of. They were also etched onto these strange stones. If he could he would take one to examine it later. Maybe he could stop using the scrolls for the mines and instead use this technology that was quite reusable. Alas, for now they needed to move forward. First, he needed to get out of here and rejoin his original party. After that he could think about the treasure. He also would need to somehow get these two to not talk about the mass of minerals. On the other side of the corridor was another door. After pushing it open they came out in another section filled with long passages and more pathways. It took another couple of hours to get past this small labyrinth once more, only to end up at another exit. One that was hidden behind some runes and impossible to access without Roland's skills. I think we should take a break. Robert called out to Roland that was scanning the hidden door for runic traps. He nodded as the time spent would amount to almost a day. With the bad ventilation that this place had, the noble lady was not looking all too great. They were in a smaller lit area that looked somewhat safe. He nodded at Robert and a strange scene unfolded. 3 people were seated around a plate of metal that gave out refreshing air. This was not the strange part, as it was the ruby wolf that was sitting right next to it and acting as the room light. Robert was used as a pillow as Lucille placed her head in his lap. Roland could tell that his older brother cared for this young girl. It was a bit funny to look at his blushing face that was more awkward than cute. Robert was similar to his father and had a very masculine look to him, thus such scenes came out quite comedic. "What are you doing?" Robert asked while glancing at Roland's hands. He had removed the scaly hide of the volcanic salamander, or at least a large chunk of it. Scribing some runes on it, it could be of use in the next room. He had his scribing kit with some magic ink with him, but some of his things remained with the porter. Some of his scrolls were in there as well, so it was good to prepare more firepower. The lack of proper scroll paper could be countered with monster hide, and a tier 2 monster would work. Robert looked in wonder at the magical ink seeping into the badly cut out monster hide. Roland inserted it on the other side as he could not place the runes on the scales. After a few minutes of scribing, he glanced up to Robert for a moment before speaking out. "You should get some rest, you didn't sleep yesterday either, the next chamber might be dangerous." "What about you?" "I'm fine, I have sleep resistance, I'll be fine even if I don't sleep for a few days." Robert nodded at the answer and the awkward silence between the two young men continued. Neither of them seemed to be good at talking, and Lucille was mostly the one that initiated the conversations with both of them. Now, with her fast asleep, these two introverts had to somehow cope with each other's presence. "Can I ask you a question?" "Go ahead." Roland answered while putting the finishing touches on the salamander pelt runic scroll. "Do you ever take that helmet off?" His hand twitched at the question, almost making him bring the scroll quality down by a grade. "I have a rare skin condition, I need to keep it on at all times, even more in this hot dungeon." "Rare skin condition? Is that some kind of illness?" "Something like that." Roland quickly evaded the question while Robert stared at his helmet. He wasn't sure what his old brother was thinking, but he needed to keep his identity hidden. If his father found him out, it would just add to his problems. Baron Wentworth was someone strong. He would not be able to resist him if he decided to drag him back to the Arden estate. He did not know what his dad would do: put him under house arrest? Force him to craft armor for the noble families? He did not know, and he did not want to find out. "When the lady wakes up, we should contact Lord Percival, tell them that we are doing fine, but it would be better to not tell them of this place. He might not appreciate us forcing the lady into this labyrinth." "We shouldn't." Roland was still hoping to keep this place hidden. If they reported about the long corridors, the cave with the costly minerals would be revealed. Convincing Robert and the lady would be hard though, but they also needed to make reports. They also needed to know what was happening outside and when the rescue party would arrive. "I'll have to consult with the lady." "Yes." The awkward silence continued. How long they would be stuck here remained a mystery. For the time being, Roland showed off some of his bombs and scrolls to Robert while thinking that maybe later they might have to use them. Time continued to pass. How long these four would be stuck here remained unknown. Chapter 124, going in reverse. "We have sent 2 of the adventurers along with 2 knights to deliver a message to the Adventurers Guild. Lady Lucille, I'll have to ask you to remain strong." Roland and Robert were to the side and looking at the crystal ball. In it was Lord Percival, who was now talking with Lady Lucille. 2 days have passed since they had become trapped in this series of underground caverns. They were all now before a hidden door that could lead into another trapped room. From what his mapping device told him, it looked to be quite an open space. It was even larger than what this device could show him. From his previous experiences, it could mean a few things. 1, it would be similar to the troglodyte cavern. When they entered, the doors would close and monsters would start piling on top of them. The second option was a more tame one. It could very well just be the exit into the larger volcanic dungeon. The large space that he could not map fully could be the lower dungeon. He did not believe that this was the case, as it would be far too easy. It could also be a room filled with more traps, maybe some puzzles, and then finally the thing that he was afraid of the most, a hidden boss chamber. He only had 2 party members that he was not very familiar with. They have also sheltered nobles that didn't have experience in fighting against monsters bigger and stronger than they were. Even though Robert had trained in a similar way as he did, there was a difference in fighting goblins than large hobgoblins that outleveled a person. "Thank you, Lord Percival, tell Charlene that I'm doing fine." After a bit, the magic sphere went out and the talk was over. Lucille didn't disclose much after Roland asked her not to tell the noble commander that they were moving deeper into the dungeon. "Are you sure it was the right thing to do, sir?" "Wayland. It's better to not make them worry. They can't really help us here, and the rescue party won't be arriving for at least a few more days." Lucille was not a person that liked to lie. He had to convince her that it would be unwise to make her friends worry. After this, she changed her tune. Roland felt bad about using a person that had a more rosy outlook on life like this girl, but he needed to look at his own well-being. "Lord Percival would have told us to return if he knew. I think you made the right decision, Lady Lucille." It seemed that Robert on the other hand saw it his way. He wasn't sure what his reason for it was though. More than likely he just didn't think that sitting around and twiddling their thumbs would help with anything. He had always been quite headstrong and someone that pushed on forward even when many things got in his way. "What do you think is past that door, sir?" "Wayland. It could be another trapped room." Roland was a bit suspicious about this place, as after entering these corridors they had not come across any type of monster. "Can your device ascertain such a thing?" Lucille asked while glancing at Roland's orb that she did previously get the chance to use. "Regretfully no, but I've been meaning to add that function." This item was still a work in progress. Getting it to detect monsters and other living beings was the most he could do for now. He had used part of the golem code that he had bought not that long ago. The golems came with a function of recognizing people, animals, and monsters, and that's why his device could do it as well. To come up with a trap analyzer he would need to be a bit more original, but with the help of some of these new runic books that he studied recently he had been given some new ideas. "I won't lie to you, I have no idea what could be behind that door. It could be a swarm of volcanic monsters, or maybe just a room filled with treasure. We won't know until we enter it, and I won't force you to come with me." He wanted to move forward, as waiting for other people to help him was not really his style. Depending on others was something that Roland did not enjoy. Even though there was a noble lady here that everyone wanted to save, this didn't mean that he would be helped. The rescue party could very well climb down and only take Lucille with them. Then Robert would be next in line, while he, a regular adventurer, could very well be used as an expendable resource. They could even say that he died down in the cave and not bother with him. Thus he would rather try his luck in these unknown caves. His high level and gear gave him some confidence in being able to survive. "Sir Robert, what do you think we should do?" Lucille looked to her knight. If she told him to stay, he would stay. It seemed that Robert did not know how to go against people in a higher position than he was. He just looked at Lucille with a confused look without knowing how to answer. "If Lady Lucille thinks that we should wait, then I will remain with her here." Roland wondered if the years of subservience to his father had shaped Robert to be the perfect soldier. Which was the one that didn't ask questions and followed orders while striving to be stronger? The girl pouted slightly after seeing that Robert wouldn't give her a straight answer. He was probably unsure which option was the safer one. "Sir Wayland, you'll continue without us if we stay behind?" "Yes, I think that this should lead to some kind of exit. The dungeon monsters should not pose a big threat to us." They were all at the Tier 2 level, and the lack of Tier 3 monsters was well documented. Even monsters above the 100th level were quite rare. With his prestigious class and an assortment of runic weapons, Roland did not think that he would suffer a defeat. "I think we should follow Sir Wayland, he seems to know this dungeon. We would have already been dead if he wasn't here in the first place," the blue-haired lady proclaimed while looking at Roland with those big eyes. He was taken aback by how much faith this girl was putting in him. They met about a week ago and now he was trusting him with her life. If the roles were reversed, he wasn't sure if he could do the same. Roland nodded while feeling a bit of pressure being put on his shoulders. This girl was putting her trust into him, and even his older brother that liked to bully him in their youth was somewhat doing the same. Even though he was putting on airs, if he really didn't trust him he would probably say it. Endangering the noble lady that he fancied would come first. "Okay, check your equipment before going in, there could be monsters inside, the area is suspiciously spacious." Roland had his arming sword on his hip and the magical rod. He also possessed various spell scrolls and his magical armor. Robert was limited to the shield that he borrowed from his younger brother and an enchanted longsword. While they were talking yesterday, to break the silence he had asked his older brother to show him his sword. Regretfully, the enchantment on it was not a runic one, so he could not enhance it. It had the usual sharpening enchantment on it, which would have to be enough. Lucille only had her smaller magical rod along with some magical trinkets that enhanced her mana regeneration and spell potency. She would remain in the back with Agni, as her role was backline support. Robert would be in the very front along with Roland, that would also use some spells to aid him. "Let's go." The three humans nodded at each other while the only wolf in the party wiggled his tail. Robert pushed the door open and all of them glanced inside. The cavern was large with a lot of similar rock formations everywhere. There didn't seem to be any small openings in the walls through where the bug creatures could crawl from. There were also no lava pools through which lava-resistant ones like the volcanic salamander could go through either. It was a wide area with quite the high ceiling, it was actually hard for them to see it. Doesn't look that anything is in here. Roland thought to himself while they all inched inside. He even threw a sizable rock as far as he could to see if any traps or monsters would react. There was nothing here, so the party advanced while looking around. "Look, Sir Wayland." Lucille pointed into the distance. There they all saw a larger closed gate. It was clearly the only way that was leading out of this large chamber. Roland could also not spot any secret doors, but his debugging skill had a limited range, so he would have to examine them quite closely. "Is there really nothing here?" Robert asked while they all slowly moved towards that large gate. Roland also didn't like it, it seemed strange for nothing to be here. Unless someone cleared this room out, there should be a trap or some monster to beat for them to advance. I've read that some dungeons have dummy rooms. They expand too fast and can't always fill them with traps or monsters, maybe this is one of those. Lucille added some of the knowledge that she learned at the academy. Without seeing anything out of the ordinary, Roland would have to agree to this theory. Even after getting to the middle of the room and arriving at the larger gate, nothing was happening. "Is it fine to open?" Robert asked while glancing towards Roland and Lucille. "I can feel magic around this area, but that could just be the dungeon." It was hard to make out magical traps in dungeons that were created through magic as well. Only when a trap was obvious, or when people had specialized skills for magic trap detection, would they be alerted to them. Roland used his ball to scan what was further inside, but this time around he was getting a lot of interference. It seemed that this door was blocking his sphere from scanning what was behind it. Robert slowly pulled on the large chain that was attached to the door while Lucille prepared a spell. A monster could be waiting for them on the other side, and with nowhere else to go they needed to open this large door. The door was about 4 meters in height and quite wide as well. Even Robert with his tier 2 strength had problems in pulling this door open. "Hey, watch out!" As the gap in the door opened wider, Roland saw something. An elongated hand with 4 claw-like fingers extended while trying to claw whoever was there. Robert was lucky that he was opening the door while protecting his body with it at the same time. Roland was quick to fire off an ice arrow spell that connected with this hand. Robert quickly closed the door by pushing on it, which caused the now frozen monster hand to snap and fall to the ground. "What was that?" Lucille lost her composure slightly, but luckily they had Roland to pick up the slack. "Why are those monsters so close to the door?" Roland asked while finding this dungeon area a bit odd. Soon he would have his answer, as after closing the door they heard some kind of strange sound. This sound was coming from above, it was as if something was falling down. Then with a resounding roar it appeared, a monster fell down from the high ceiling as if it was some kind of trap waiting to be triggered. The creature was quite large as well and was somewhat similar to a theropod. It had dark red scales covering its body. 2 rows of dark blue, bony plates running along its back, going from the eyes to the tail. It had a large mouth, very similar to the popular predator from the Jurassic World. The main feature of this dinosaur-like monster was its huge, sword-like tail. The moment it landed it started swinging it around while trying to home in on its prey. This would be the blue-haired noble lady that at this moment was the closest person to it. Bladed volcanic Cornitoris L123. "My lady, get behind me!" Robert shouted out loud while also tapping his shield with his sword. This was enough to move the attention from the panicking ice mage. The monster gave out another loud scream as it charged towards its new target. Each time its large feet took a step the whole cavern rumbled and pebbles rained down on them. Roland was not far behind. While the monster took the bait he activated his magical rod. It gave out a chilling sensation before a large ball of ice was created. This ball traveled at high velocity and collided with the large monster's side. Crystals of ice started to appear on the monster the moment this spell connected. The monster turned its large T-Rex-looking head towards Roland while stopping its advance. Lucille had since recovered her composure and followed Roland's example by hitting the monster with one of her own ice spells. Frost Ball. They were lucky enough to be on the other side of the room as the beast fell right into the middle. Roland circled around it from one side while Lucille along with Robert stayed on the other. Both of the magic casters utilized their freezing spells to slow down this dinosaur-looking monster. Just like the other creatures in this dungeon, it didn't seem to be able to contend with the cold. Most of these monsters were cold-blooded. This meant that their temperature varied depending on the environment they were in. They required high temperatures to make their bodies operate. If these temperatures dropped for some reason, these creatures would start to slow down. Their metabolism would be halted and they would go into something similar to a coma or winter sleep. At that point, it would be easy to kill even a big creature like this that was unable to move. It's working. A cone of snow along with sharp ice crystals was released by Lucille as she followed Roland's instructions. The monster was slowing down, but it was also able to take quite some of this freezing energy. The icicles that would normally shred any normal skin were just bouncing off the Cornitora's hard plate-covered body. Roland could also see it. Without the freezing advantage, it would be hard to damage this monster. It outleveled everyone here, and it was even armored. Their swords would have a hard time piercing down to the fleshy bits. After freezing it, on the other hand, they would probably be able to jab them through its eye sockets to get to the brain. It was a bit strange that this monster appeared after they opened and then closed the door. Roland could only attribute this to the way they entered here. It almost seemed like they were going through a dungeon in reverse. That would explain why there were monsters in close proximity to the boss chamber. They were probably meant to kill them from the other side before going inside of here. Then the monster would come out after they closed the door. If they had that knowledge beforehand, it might have been better to not close that door. The monsters on the other side didn't seem to be as strong as this one here. Luckily they had two ice mages working on disabling this monster, and it seemed to be over. Roland shivered slightly while looking at the giant ice statue before him. Most of this monster's body was covered in ice with just a part of its head sticking out. Its eyes were now closed and it was not moving. Did we do it? Good job, Lady Lucille. Robert and Lucille rejoiced while Roland slowly moved closer. He was the furthest from the creature while his brother and Lucille were a lot closer. Hey, what are you doing? Quickly kill it! Roland shouted as he felt something. This was all somewhat too easy. Was putting this monster on ice enough to kill it? He shouted at Robert to deliver the killing blow as he was too far away to sink his blade between those armored plates. Then before Robert could realize, the monster opened its eyes and gave out a strange high-pitched screech. The whole party had to cover their ears while backing away. Arg, what is it doing? His vision became blurry for a moment, and when he looked up he could see a big cloud of steam. The monster started glowing red with energy and the ice it was covered in started to thaw. Soon it burst free, now covered in red lava-like energy that slowly dripped down those thick-looking plates. The sword on its tail was ignited as it swung it towards the ground. This attack, after connecting with the hard rock, sent a barrage of flaming earth straight at Roland, who quickly activated a magical shield to protect himself. It didn't seem that the battle was over yet, it had only just begun. Chapter 125 Tough Fight. Roland looked at the monster that had gained an enraged status after it had been frozen. Some of its health had dropped, but it was now quickly regenerating back up. The monster started looking different than before. It switched to a deep red coloration, its horns and dorsal spine increased in size. The largest difference was the sword-like tail, which was now burning up. It looked as if it was covered with magma, which was also radiating from some cracks in the armor-like plates the monster was covered in. While Lucille and Robert were stunned by the monster's second form, Roland raised his rod. The runes glowed in a chilling blue light before a large ball of ice formed in front of it. This ball was then shot off while spinning around. The monster was still slow as before, but this time around, when this ball of ice snow collided with it, it started to quickly melt. The Cornitoris roared out and opened up its mouth. In it, Roland could see the flame-producing sac organ which this type of creature was known for. Shit! He quickly started running sideways. If he was a second late he would have been charred. The concentrated flamethrower-like breath collided with the spot Roland was previously in. Even the hard rocks started to melt from the high temperature. The monster didn't stop with its magma-like projectile attack. It followed after its prey by swinging its head sideways and trying to hit Roland as he was running. His armor was lighting up in green as he switched on his agility buffing runes to make a fast getaway. Without his runic shield in his hands, he was not confident in blocking this attack with a regular magic shield. Even though he had that runic program in his armor, it wasn't specialized for it. Don't worry, Sir Wayland. While feeling a burning inferno at his back, he heard a woman's voice from afar. It was Lucille shouting out. Robert was next to her with the shield raised and sword in one hand. The young ice mage started concentrating and gathering mana. She closed her eyes and chanted as fast as she could. The blue crystal on her magical rod started pulsating with energy, and slowly the spell started to take shape. It looked to be a large spire of ice. It was quite thick at the base and became thinner the further it went, culminating in quite the sharp top. Ice Lance! After completion, the girl shouted out and pointed her magical weapon at the monster in the distance. The large spear of ice flew forward. The added distance only gave it more time to gain speed. The attack headed right at the monster's side. Lucille hoped that even the monster's thick plates would not be able to resist such a heavy and fast-moving object. Regretfully, the monster would not allow this to be tested as it noticed this large human-sized icicle coming its way. It turned its body while swinging that giant sword tail at the incoming ice lance. It managed to slice it in two while only part of it collided with its heated-up plates. Due to the loss of size and momentum, the damage was minor. The monster now looked to Lucille and Robert while Roland was given a well-deserved breather. Agni appeared at his side and started whining. It was clear that the tamed beast would not be able to last even one hit. Agni, go and hide. The ruby wolf curled up its tail as it felt without use. He was smart enough to know that he would only get in the way, so it decided to bide its time for the moment that he could be useful. While Agni was moving away, Roland looked at the lava-covered ground that was melted by this creature. He did not think that his armor would offer him enough resistance against this monster's attack. Even if he pumped all of his mana into his ice shield, he would only last a few seconds before it gave out. This thing is resistant to ice. This was one of the worst possible outcomes. Previously they enjoyed a rather easy time against the lesser monsters in this dungeon. It was enough to just lower their temperature slightly and they would just shut down. This one, on the other hand, had some kind of internal heating organ. Even when they brought its temperature below 0 degrees, it could just heat itself back up. The monster was also a large one, and they only had one-handed swords with not much weight behind them. Roland had brought things along as a large two-handed axe and hammer for such an occasion, but it was left behind with the porters. The bag that he had with him only had his run-smithing tools along with provisions. The spatial bag he had lacked the capacity, and carrying a backpack in the dungeon was too much of a hindrance while fighting. Thus he was only left with some bombs, spell scrolls, and what he had on himself. None of these things would probably be able to cause long-lasting damage to this monster. It was heavily armored and had quite thick legs. There was also the huge burning sword tail, which was a problem in itself. Would he be even able to resist it with his runic shield? Or would he be sliced in half with one swing? It didn't seem like he would have much time to reorganize his thoughts though, as the monster gave out another giant scream. He expected it to fire another flaming breath or charge at Robert and Lucille. Instead of doing that, it took out a wider stance while arching its back. What is it doing? He could soon spot the tips of the backplate spikes glowing brighter than before. Roland took a step back before looking at Robert and Lucille. Don't just stand there, scatter both of you. Lucille was surprised at Roland's outburst while Robert furrowed his brows while looking at the monster. He seemed to understand the situation as he quickly sheathed his sword and lunged towards Lucille. Sir Robert? What are you doing? Forgive me, my lady. The knight lifted up the noble lady with both his hands and started running. Almost at the same time, those glowing back spikes shot up into the air. They were clearly heated up and produced dark smoke. There were 4 large spikes that at the apex of their trajectory exploded. This produced many smaller red-hot embers that plummeted to the ground in various directions. Roland saw this and started dodging at max speed. The moment one of these glowing chunks collided with something on the ground, a small explosion occurred. They were slow-moving enough for Roland with his agility buff to react in time. On the other hand, Robert and Lucille weren't as lucky. Robert raised his shield while one of these projectiles collided with it. The explosion rattled his hand and tossed him along with the girl he was carrying to the side. The Arden Knight didn't let this be their demise though. He firmly grasped the runic shield that he was given and activated its magical effect. A large shield of ice appeared while he held it in place. Roland could see the many explosive projectiles colliding with this shield while he was trying to evade them himself. The shield of ice was quickly faltering and only more mana could mend the holes back up. He was in no position to help them though. From afar he tried casting a few runic spells, but there were far too many of those flaming balls coming down. It looked like a small meteor shower raining down from the sky. Robert was somehow able to defend himself and Lucille, but he was slowly reaching the limit of his mana. This shield was not designed for someone like him in mind. It would quickly drain a non-mage in a matter of moments. The monster was also there and it could see the stationary targets. It opened up its maw once more. The target this time was Robert and the melting shield of ice that he was holding. The explosive rain was almost over, but it didn't seem that this monster would be letting up. It had clearly produced this attack to somehow tie its targets into one location. This time around it wasn't a breath of molten lava, the charge up was not there. Before Roland could interrupt this attack, a large ball of fire traveled from the creature's mouth. "Watch out!" he shouted while Robert turned the shield to intercept this ball of flames. A loud explosion resounded through the area. There was a lot of dust created by the previous attack along with this one. Roland could not see what happened to his 2 party members. After raising his magic rod higher, he produced many frozen arrows. From the other side, he also activated his armor and created a few arrows made from hard rock. The magical attacks flew forward and successfully interrupted the monster's second flame attack, however it also made it turn its massive head back towards Roland. Smoke and steam were pushed out into this room, raising the temperature to an uncomfortable point. Even with these frost runes turned on, he was starting to feel the heat. The monster opened up its mouth and started charging. This time it used a different tactic by firing off more concentrated flame balls. These were quite hard to evade. With the constant increase of smoke, it only made things harder for Roland. He found himself moving his hand forward and activating his shielding spells, just as one of the flame balls exploded next to him. This sent him flying into the nearby wall. His deep steel armor plates started rattling and bending out of shape before he fell back down to the ground. Roland felt a metallic taste in his mouth as his HP decreased by a large chunk. It seemed that fighting this monster at range was impossible. It had a wide range of attacks while also did not take much damage from any spells that he could cast. The earth spells bounced off while the ice ones melted almost instantly. Using fire spells and wind ones didn't feel advised as well, which left a few that could cause some damage. A T-Rex-like head emerged from the smoke. Its aim was his head. Roland quickly opened one of the pouches on his belt. A series of small cards were tossed out which quickly turned into balls of electricity. The monster, instead of biting through Roland's armor, got electrocuted. The lightning spell's energy seemed to be able to cause some harm to it as it was able to ignore the armored plates. Regretfully, it didn't seem to be packing up enough of a punch, as even when the monster was stopped in its tracks for a moment, it quickly recovered. It turned around and instead of using its mouth, it utilized that giant flaming bladed tail. Roland's armor started glowing in green as he quickly backed away. He wasn't fast enough and he could only brace himself while protecting his head with both his sword and the thick magic rod. Even with both of these items and while also wearing deep steel gauntlets, the monster's tail shredded right through them. He was tossed back again with both of his weapons breaking. The mana stones on his gauntlets burst and the metal bent as he tumbled back while almost getting both of his hands broken. Gah! After rolling for a while, he ended up almost in the middle of the room. His gauntlets had the runic components needed for him to cast spells. After the attack, one of them became unusable, nothing more than scrap metal. The other one was badly damaged and the runic components were unusable. Thankfully he had his runic mending skill, which he activated instantly. The runic mending caused his mana to drop further and give him a migraine. The gauntlet was not the only damaged runic part, as his back and chest plate had been damaged as well. Missing mana stones, arms that were bleeding, and a monster with over 60% of its HP was standing before him. He had barely enough time to stand up before the monster had charged at him again. With his injuries and his armor being mangled up, he now had a tougher time in evading the attacks. The monster was becoming slower as well, but it was clear that if this continued for longer that he would be the one losing. This was a clear difference in levels. This monster was resistant to most magic that he could throw at it, even the electric spells only phased it for a moment. There was a big difference in levels as well as size, and the versatility that this monster showed didn't help either. Roland quickly found himself going through all of his spell scrolls. Various elemental magics rained down on the monster's thick hide and he could see it losing its health points. It wasn't enough. It was clear that this monster was some kind of special evolution that might be comparable to his Runesmith Lord class's rarity. With not much else to do, he went for his trump card. He threw the previously created runic scroll that he made from the ruby salamander's hide. It was aimed at the ground while he retreated. The moment the Cornitoris approached, the trap was activated. Large thick vines sprung out from this spell scroll and attacked the enemy before it. The large monster was momentarily wrapped up, but even now Roland could see that it wouldn't hold it in place for long. In his spatial bag, he had a certain attachment. It looked like welded together iron pipes that could connect to his working gauntlet's top part, which was closer to the vambrace. This attachment had mana stones placed on the rear sides of these deep steel pipes. Runes were clearly visible on the entire structure. He took aim. With this item on his forearm, he pointed with his right hand at the roaring monster. The armor accessory that looked like a circular row of pipes started shining. The mana stones lit up along with the runic components and sparks started flying. Roland could feel his mana reserves being drained rapidly as he tried keeping awake. This thing was something he created as a last-ditch effort, as it had many drawbacks. The armor he was wearing lit up in red as all the runes reacted. The monster started shaking around and the thick vines that were made from plant matter began to burn up. It looked at its small enemy. Roland at this moment was pointing with his right hand at it while holding the forearm with his left. His whole suit was radiating magical energy and the monster's instincts were telling him that it was in danger. It opened up its mouth and got ready to burn its enemy to cinders, but before it could breathe out, Roland's magical attack was activated. It created a bright multicolored beam of energy that flew forward and then collided with the mass of magma. The monster's attack was drilled into by this lance-wide attack and connected with the monster's head in almost a fraction of a second. A huge explosion followed the clash of these two ranged attacks and made everything hard to see. Did that do it? Roland's hands dropped down as he couldn't move a muscle. He had burned through almost all of his mana with that one attack and was unable to move. The magic beam clearly connected with the monster's head and pierced through it. He was even able to see it connecting with the chamber walls. HSSSSS. A strange hissing sound was suddenly heard by him and the smoke cleared. The creature was revealed with quite the slack jaw. It looked like the attack connected lower than he had anticipated, leaving it very much alive. It looked like it had somehow twisted its body and neck to the side at the last moment to evade this beam. Part of its neck was damaged but its brain was still intact. Fuck. Without a big chunk of its mouth, the monster slowly approached. It was quite injured and its HP was almost gone, but it could still move. This was not something that Roland could do. His legs felt like they were stuck in concrete, he could not move a muscle, and keeping his eyes open was the most he could do. The creature lumbered towards him at a slow pace, but the large strides quickly brought it over to where Roland was standing. This looked like it was the end. One swipe with its large claws or that sword tail and it would be over. Suddenly a howling sound could be heard, and from the side like a bolt of lightning, a certain ruby wolf came. He lunged himself on the monster's damaged mouth and started biting. He utilized his attacking skill that injected flames into its mouth while also using his tail to pierce the monster's eye. The angry monster started shaking its massive body around while trying to dislodge the small wolf from its head. Its small raptor-like arms came into play as they were long enough to swipe at the intruder. A yelp was heard as Agni's body was slashed by the monster and he was forced to let go. The ruby wolf's body tumbled to the side while the enraged monster looked to the annoying opponent. This loss of focus was used by another person. As if he was waiting for the right moment, Robert came charging from the side and delivered a precise shield bash to the monster's side. Being already injured this much, this was enough to tip the beast over. This wasn't the end as Roland heard Lucille's voice chanting a spell. When he glanced at her, he could see a massive ice spike hovering over her head. It was a lot larger than the ice spear she created before. The spell was released. The injured monster protected itself once more by swinging its giant tail at this glacial lance. The spell connected with the beast, which did quite some damage to the long sturdy tail, but it was not enough. Lucille was still only a low-leveled frost mage, she just didn't have enough magical energy to deliver the finishing blow. But this wasn't over. Roland saw an opportunity. With his hands shaking, he reached into his satchel once more, from which he pulled out some round orbs. This was the last remaining ammunition that he had, and he would need to trust his older brother with this. Robert threw it into its mouth. With a last resort, he threw 3 orbs towards his half-brother. He instantly tumbled forward and collapsed on the ground while the items landed a few meters away from Robert. Robert was also in quite a bad condition. The previous monster attack blew away the shield with a chunk of his armor. His shoulder on the side that he held the shield had been broken along with his arm. He was still in better shape than his younger brother. The orbs that he saw before him were something he had seen before. Remembering the explanation that Roland had given him, he quickly took them into his good hand. The monster slowly stood up and glanced down at the person that rammed into it from the side. "Eat this, you overgrown salamander." Robert chucked the bundled-up spheres at the monster that lacked a lower jaw. With good aim, the 3 runic items made it into its mouth. Before the monster could realize what it had swallowed, it could feel its neck expanding. With a very characteristic sound, the neck of the monster exploded. Its head was tossed up into the air and landed close to the knight that tossed the runic grenades into its mouth. The battle was finally over. The 3 humans remained victorious, each one injured more than the other and still all trapped in this dungeon. Chapter 126, Resting Before the Return. The bladed volcanic Cornitoris lay down on the ground, its large body missing a head that had rolled over to the side. The battle was over and Roland could hear the system giving him a message. "You have gained 82689 experience points. For dealing the most damage to a boss-type enemy more than 25 levels above your current level, you have achieved the Goliath Slayer title. You have leveled up." Roland dropped down onto his posterior and started panting. He soon collapsed onto his back while having a hard time breathing. His eyes started to close, but before he could pass out he felt something slippery touch his face. It was Agni that had limped over from the side. His tamed beast had been knocked away and suffered some injuries after being clawed. He was bleeding and his side had a large gash. "Good boy." Agni received a weak pat on the head before Roland raised himself into a sitting position. The injured wolf's legs started giving out, but Roland was quick in catching his injured beast. With shaky hands, Roland reached into his satchel. During the hectic fight, he didn't even have time to drink one of these potions. Now they were needed to save Agni. He quickly brought out one of the healing potions and started pouring it over Agni's large wound. It started sizzling and slowly closing. Thanks to their connection, he could see Agni's status screen. After checking it, he could see the bleeding status slowly being grayed out before disappearing. Roland gave out a sigh of relief. His tamed beast would make it out alive while also gaining a couple of levels. He was next in line to drink some recovery potions. Mana, health, and stamina potions quickly made it into his mouth as he recovered. He was preoccupied with his party members, but he could hear the system mention that he had gained multiple levels from gaining so much experience. Robert was holding onto his broken shoulder while also collapsing onto his back. He could tell that his older brother was quite tired. Lucille at this time was face down on the ground as well. She had probably passed out from using up all of her mana during that last spell. The experience in this world was somewhat shared, and depending on who did the most damage they would receive most of it. Even though the two contributed less than him, they would also be receiving quite a lot. Robert would most likely be handsomely rewarded due to him landing the finishing blow. Goliath Slayer. Title. While in possession of this title, you deal 5% more damage to monsters that outlevel you by more than 25 levels. The title gave a flat boost to damage. He had also gained some levels after this fight. This one dead monster gave him the equivalent of fighting hundreds of those ruby salamanders. If he had to choose, he would rather fight hundreds of those smaller monsters one by one than face this thing alone again. Ugh, wish these potions worked faster. Where is a priest when you need one? Priests and clerics like the woman that they brought along had various buffing magics. They would allow the party members to recover their mana and stamina at a quicker pace. It would have been nice if that healer they had taken along had fallen down here with them, but luckily he didn't lose any limbs. His right hand was in a world of hurt. He received a full hit from that monster that destroyed both his sword and rod. The pieces were still scattered around this large open cavern. This thing needs a rework. Roland looked at his right hand. On it was the melted attachment that he placed on his wrist. It had somewhat fused with his gauntlet at this point and rendered it nothing more than junk. With this he had lost both of his hand protectors and would be unable to discharge spells through them. His armor was also barely holding together. The only lucky thing about this was that his helmet had stayed on his head for the entire battle. Thus Robert could not see his face even after all of this had happened. I need to give them the healing potions. Finally, Roland moved his tired and beat-up body in motion. Robert had a whole broken shoulder after holding steady and protecting Lucille as a proper knight. He had to give it to his older brother. He had some balls. He prioritized the woman's life over his own, even though he could have easily just abandoned her. Roland wasn't sure how deep of a relationship these two had, but he hoped that the girl would appreciate the gesture when she woke up. Are you awake? Be barely. Robert gave Roland a weak smile while looking pale. Your shoulder, I'll have to. I know, get it over with. Robert knew that the broken bone needed to be aligned before the healing potion was drunk. Roland was not a cleric, but he knew first aid and would be able to push the bone into the right place. Arg! Robert gave out a grunt while pushing the fingers from his good arm into the rocky ground. After the bones were somewhat set in place, Roland poured the red healing potion on the injury. Then the rest was given for drinking. These potions were high quality and would be even able to heal the broken bones within a few hours of being drunk. For faster healing, something like an elixir would be required, or a powerful cleric spell. How do you feel? I'm fine, but Lady Lucille, you should think about your own health before worrying about others. Roland stood up and moved towards the passed-out frost mage. She had a magnificent face planted on the ground while making a T-pose. This was one of those times when he missed having a smartphone to document it for future generations. Before Robert could shout at him from the distance, he flipped the girl over. She was given a mana potion, healing potion, and a stamina potion. Lucille had the least amount of wounds besides a few scratches here and there. Robert had successfully managed to protect her life at his own expense. There didn't seem to be any monsters around for now. There was even a chest that popped up in the middle of this chamber. It was similar to the one at the boss room on the 10th level, with the biggest difference being that it was made of silver. My lady! Even before his arm could heal, Robert had dragged his body over to the passed-out Lucille. The group of three and the wolf were now sitting all together and resting. Finally, after a few minutes, Lucille awoke. The first thing she saw was Robert's concerned face that was quite close to her own. Sir Robert! She quickly raised her head out of panic, which made her forehead collide with Robert's nose. The two started holding their faces while Roland stared at the comedic duo. A small chuckle even escaped from his mouth that he quickly hid away by moving his helmet-covered face to the side. What happened? Where is the monster? Is Sir Wayland alive? I'm fine, thanks for your concern, Lady Lucille. Sir Wayland. You are well. Relax, breathe in, Sir Robert, can you explain to the lady and calm her down? Roland stood up after resting for a bit and let the knight talk to his lady. While he explained how the monster was defeated, Roland would go over to the treasure chest. Silver chest high. It was quite the well-built chest that was somewhat a carbon copy of the bronze one he saw in the ruby golem boss chamber. It didn't seem to have any locks or traps on it, but Roland was not willing to risk it. He would rather not get shot by some strange spells or arrows when he opened it. He grabbed the bladed part of his broken arming sword that he finally found. With it, he slowly moved the chest lid open. Just like with the bronze chest, there was nothing out of the ordinary. When looking inside, he could see some items. Crescent axe high. Enchanted STR +5. Well-kept old deep silver battle axe with a long hilt and a crescent-shaped blade. Deep silver high. Just like deep steel, there were other alloys similar to it. Even though this one was called deep silver, it didn't mean that it was less sturdy than steel. The silver counterpart was quite similar in that regard, but it had some other properties like having added damaging effects against undead creatures. Roland did not think the added price was worth the expenditure, so he continued using deep steel. Both of these metals had the same resistance to runic erosion, so it didn't matter that much to him. This will come in handy. Roland held the weapon out. It was a long two-handed weapon, more in line with a halberd than an actual axe. He did not have his axe-related skills leveled up that much, but this was better than not having a weapon at all. The added strength would also boost his attacking power for when they entered the corridor filled with those monsters. Besides the weapon, there were 3 deep silver bars along with some silver coins. These dungeon coins could be used along with the minted kingdom coins, as everything was still being counted by this world's system as the same. Roland felt like this reward was not that great. The monster trashed his armor and destroyed his deep steel weapons. It also put a big dent in his runic shield that he lent to his half-brother. All in all, this would probably barely cover the repair costs. There was also the problem of not being able to take the monster along with them for parts. This T-Rex look-alike would probably go for some gold coins. Its tail could probably be fashioned into a two-handed sword. He lacked a large enough spatial bag to fit it in. He would regretfully have to leave the monster there, but there was still one item that he could take, the Mana Stone. It was quite large but also deep inside the monster's insides. This creature was over level 100 and halfway towards tier 3. It was a miracle that they were able to defeat it already. We should be safe for the time being. Sir Wayland, what about those monsters behind that large gate? Won't they enter this room? I don't think so. How so? Asked the blue-haired lady that was in the process of getting her hair in place. I have a theory about this hidden dungeon. Roland started to explain about finding this place odd. The moment that door was opened, the boss appeared, but when they entered from the other side, nothing happened. This didn't make sense unless they entered the boss chamber from the wrong side. The correct path to this boss chamber was probably at another location. The path they took was a secret backdoor. The creatures behind those gates were just the usual mobs that were protecting the boss chamber. The room was more than likely created in a way that only when the door was opened and then closed did the boss monster spawn in. Fascinating, but doesn't that mean? Yes, if we follow that path we should be able to come out at the intended entrance, which should probably take us to the main dungeon. Robert gave out a sigh while Lady Lucille clapped her hands together. She quickly moved her hand to the side to where her pouch was, or at least where it should be. Hey! Is something wrong, Lady Lucille? My items, I think my spatial pouch was destroyed during the monster attack. Lucille added while remembering something hitting her side. When a spatial item was damaged from the outside, whatever was inside of it became lost in the void. The bag itself would become nothing more than scrap leather. We can't contact Lord Percival now, they might think we are dead. That's regrettable. We won't be able to give them our location even when we leave this place. This was a setback that Roland could live with. If Robert or Lucille actually reported that he pulled two nobles into a boss fight, he might get the gallows for it. At that time revealing his true heritage would be the only way to save his hide. The two didn't seem like they would reveal this secret if he asked them about it. His older brother had surprisingly mellowed down, but that could have been the effect of the woman next to him. He might have been holding back, unwilling to show his old violent tendencies. "I'm not sure if we can stay here for too long." "Why is that, Sir Wayland?" asked Lucille, and Roland started to explain to her how these boss chambers worked. "So Sir Wayland is saying that if we stay here for too long that monster could appear again." "Yes, we should not be in any danger for now, but I would not stay here for more than a day. Then there is that door. We might have to charge in through it and lock ourselves in with those monsters. If we retreat into this chamber its boss might appear again." Roland didn't think he would be able to battle the monster with his broken armor. He might be able to set up a few traps, but the only real resource he had was the deep silver he just found, a few metal ores from that hidden chamber, and the boss monster's remains to scribe some scrolls. "Is that so?" Lucille looked at the dead monster that was in the process of being sniffed by a now recovered Agni. It was clear to Roland that his pooch was interested in the sizable mana stone that was still inside that dinosaur. "Never thought I'd see one of these." "You recognize this monster?" "Yes, I've consulted some books to see what kind of creatures inhabit volcanic dungeons like this. I never thought to see a variant of the volcanic Cornitoris." Lucille's eyes sparkled a bit. The girl seemingly liked to read about beasts as well. Normally the only version of this monster did not possess a bladed tail. It was also not able to heat itself up as much, but still possessed the iconic flame breath. This type of monster could even evolve into a land dragon if it managed to reach Tier 3. It would be still a lesser form of a dragon, but still a monster that would require a whole party of Tier 3 adventurers to defeat it. "You should try to regain as much strength as you can, we will have to leave soon," Roland said while standing up. He needed to pick up the scrap metal that was once his weapons and armor. Without his gauntlets, he could still somewhat use his feet to produce some magical effects, but he would need to change his fighting style. There was also the monster's remains. Just like with the salamander, he might be able to make some backup scrolls to blast those monsters in the corridors. Before he could walk away, he felt someone touch his side. "Sir Wayland, I'll be sure to ask my father to give you a hefty reward when we return," Lucille shouted while Robert was quick to give some praise. "Yes, the Arden estate will also provide a bonus for your services. If it wasn't for you, we all would have perished long ago. Would you perhaps be interested in moving? I'm sure my father will be glad to hire such a promising craftsman and adventurer." "Hefty reward? Moving?" He thought about how he would need to explain to a viscount why he endangered the life of his daughter. Then even the worst thing of having Robert somehow bring his pops into this predicament. "Those won't be needed. But Sir Wayland, we have to give you some kind of reward." "A reward? If you want to give me a reward, then how about?" "Yes? Anything you want." Lucille's big eyes started to shine brightly as she waited for Roland to speak. "How about we keep this little accident between us?" "Hey!" Both Robert and Lucille were surprised by the request, but soon Roland went further into the explanation. "I fear that instead of being rewarded I might be punished for putting a young lady's life in jeopardy." "Ah!" Lucille dropped her head and started thinking. Robert as well nodded, finding that what Roland was proposing made sense. Yes, the lady's father might not react kindly. "Father is more reasonable than that, I think." Lucille was a bit taken aback by Roland's reaction, but after thinking for a moment she nodded as well. Soon they all reach a consensus. For Roland's sake they would keep this boss battle secret. The party of 4 decided to rest a day in this boss chamber while keeping watch. Then they would attempt to break through the gate where the monster's arm appeared. If Roland's hunch was right, the path forward would get increasingly easier the further they went, but time would only tell. His armor needed repairing, the shield could be somewhat hammered back into shape. Robert still had his sword, and Lucille's magical rod was in working order as well. With the two-handed axe all of them had some kind of weapon. If he was able to create some more scrolls from the monster's remains, he felt that he would be able to clear out the strongest enemies waiting for them inside. After that, their weapons and skills would need to suffice. First I need to fix the shield. Roland nodded as he got to work. It was time to move forward and escape this trap. Chapter 127 Scorching Tides. It was better when we had Wayland along. A rather sweaty half-elven girl in full leather gear was seen treading through a wide-open area filled with pools of lava. You need to come here more often and build up your heat resistance skill and stop relying on magical contraptions. A man with a large frame and tan skin was walking in front of her. He was quite handsome. His upper arms weren't covered by any armor, but from his forearms and below, thick dark gauntlets could be seen. "Shut up, Armand, it would have been better if you fell into that hole instead of Wayland. You think I wouldn't want that blue-haired noble girl around with me instead? Damn, it would be a waste if anything happened to her, and that bastard is lucky enough to be with her for so long." Lobelia furrowed her eyebrows before giving a kick to Armand's shin guard. The large man didn't even flinch, as he was used to getting poked and prodded by his younger sister. The two had been tasked to go back to Albrook City. They had to run while mostly evading the monsters, while the 2 nights they were given were more of a burden than help. After a full day of going through the dungeon and not sleeping, they were able to arrive at the Adventurers Guild to give the report. Armand remembered it well, as the old guild master looked like he had laid an egg. He was really pale after hearing that his precious runesmith and the nobles were trapped in some unknown underground cave with no way of climbing back up. He could recall him blowing a fuse and shouting at everyone before scrambling back into his office. Armand looked back this fondly, as this was the first time he saw the old fart in so much distress. It made the whole fiasco of him losing his old post actually somewhat worthwhile. After losing his position, he was scolded by his family members. He also had to quit going to the red light district for the time being. The money had to go to his equipment and the orphanage, as the prices had increased. Luckily for him, the monster parts that they brought in were enough to cover the costs, and the other family members also pitched in. Even though he wasn't totally broke, it didn't change the fact that he still didn't like the person that caused this. Wayland the runesmith. He didn't think that he could get along with a stiff like that. Whenever he thought about his face that he rarely showed, he wanted to put his fist through it. His 2 step-sisters weren't helping either, always taking that guy's side over his for some reason. It was clear to him that he might have been able to handle things differently that time. He was still a work in progress, but it would be hard to change his boisterous ways. This is how he was, cocky and full of vigor. Is that the only thing that you can think about? Lobelia frowned even more after hearing Armand disclose his desires of being trapped in a room with the blue-haired noble. The noble lady was quite beautiful and had porcelain-like skin to match it. She didn't want to admit it, but she was defeated in a couple of places, but still thought that her face was much better than what the ice mage had. Continuing their report, a climbing specialist had to be rushed over to Albrook from another dungeon town. It took a couple of days to assemble the rescue team, and they headed back at the moment they arrived. Guildmaster Ordhan and the mayor were rushing them all the way to the dungeon entrance. At one point they even thought that the old man would join them on the expedition. They rushed back down past the 10th level that luckily had its boss killed beforehand. Now they were on the way towards the large lava lake that they passed by previously. The side passage had collapsed after the volcanic worms burst through the mountain. This was a dungeon though, and they worked in mysterious ways. It wouldn't be odd for the cliff passage to have mended itself back to health. The holes that adventurers produced with their high-powered attacks tended to vanish after a week of time. It was as if the dungeon was some kind of huge organism that had a slow healing factor. They were traveling with 3 new adventurers. They were of a particular beastman race. They had short white beards, short tails, and long black horns. The most characteristic part about them were their rectangular eyes. These adventurers were part of a mountain goat beastman tribe that was famous for their climbing skills. Even without any ropes, they had certain skills that allowed them to cling to the walls for exorbitant amounts of time. The plan was for these 3 to climb down into the hole where the 3 people fell down. Each one would then attach a person to a harness that would allow them to carry them up without the need of holding on to them. They would become human-sized backpacks for these people while they climbed back up. Even with these specialists, it was dangerous. No one knew if those volcanic worms would not appear suddenly once more. They also didn't know how far down that hole was, nor how well they could use their climbing skills on the dungeon walls. "Okay, we are at the lake, it's not that far now," Lobelia said while waiting at the two knights that were as always lumbering behind the group of adventurers. The plan was for them to wait till the lava lake subsided. On the other side the noble encampment was still in place. They would meet up with Lord Percival and the others and then head over to the cliff with a smaller team of knights. Everything was being kept on the down low for now. It was clear that neither the Adventurers Guild nor the nobles wished to disclose the fact that they let a magically gifted Viscount's daughter be trapped in a new dungeon. It wasn't the first time that an accident like this happened, but this didn't mean that there would not be repercussions later. Depending on how much pull the Viscount had, he could make it uncomfortable for the guild and the nobles. "Wait, what's that? Hey? Where?" Armand squinted with his eyes while looking in the direction that Lobelia was pointing at. The lava had subsided a few minutes ago, so they were waiting for it to cover up again. They would not risk attempting to cross it while it was uncovered, as they would lose precious time. Surprisingly, something appeared right in the middle of this lake. "Wait, that red armor!" His jaw almost dropped as Armand saw someone that he was very familiar with. Lobelia as well. With her enhanced archer vision, she could see a somewhat beat-up armored man emerge from the middle of this lake. The shiny crimson armor that was his calling card was all banged up. The gauntlets were missing and it looked like the chest plate had been hit by a sledgehammer a couple of times. For some reason, the helmet looked in good shape. "Is that Wayland? Wait, that blue, is that the noble girl?" Wayland was the first one to appear. Lobelia could see him looking around before turning. It seemed that he was leaning down to help someone up, and soon Lady Lucille was right next to him. Then Agni appeared seemingly out of nowhere, followed by a knight that she saw a couple of times before. "What's going on? How are they all the way there? Didn't they fall into that hole?" Before the two could process the information, they could see the group of three looking around. After realizing why they were actually at, Lobelia could see the knight picking up the noble lady. They all took off sprinting towards where the group of adventurers was. Oh right! Lobelia realized what the problem was. The lake had been drained of lava for a few minutes. The timing that it would close up again had a certain pattern to it, but this only became clear after you watched it for an hour and got ready to cross. With no way of telling how much time they had, the group of 3 humans and 1 ruby wolf started running to safety. "Will they make it?" Lobelia cried out in shock as they were quite a ways away from where the two were now. It didn't seem that Wayland had the usual green light covering his armor, which didn't make him much faster than the knight that was carrying the lady in his arms. Armand along with Lobelia moved over to where the lake started but didn't enter. The 3 goat beastmen that were there for the climbing mission followed after them without being sure what was going on. The group of adventurers had no way of helping, as they could just wait and hope for the best. Running up to meet them halfway made no sense, as none of them seemed injured. Oh no, look! About a quarter way through, Lobelia spotted that the lava lake started expanding. Wayland was seen looking to the sides and shouting something to the knight next to him. The two started running slightly faster while the ruby wolf didn't trail that far behind. The 2 running men in their confusion lost their chance to take off the heavy armor they were wearing. If they stopped now, they would be losing more time than they would be gaining. It was a spring against time. The lava started closing in from the side and soon the path behind them was closed. The lava lake sometimes became filled from the other side first, which also produced a somewhat larger wave going towards the end where Armand and Lobelia were standing. "I don't think they are going to make it." This wave of burning death was approaching them. From what Armand and Lobelia were seeing, it didn't seem like the running speed was enough. It also didn't seem like Wayland's fancy armor was functioning correctly, as he was a lot slower than usual. "Stand back!" Armand shouted while jumping into the part of the lake that was not yet covered. "Hey, what are you doing? Do you want to die with them?" Just shut up and watch. Armand took up a wide fighting stance with his legs spread apart and knees bent. It somewhat looked like a traditional karate stance, but what he was up to, Lobelia had no idea. His tanned body started turning red in a similar fashion as when he activated his body enhancement skill. There was a small difference though, this crimson color started moving towards his right fist. Soon his whole forearm was glowing in red while his muscles contracted. He kept his eyes closed while concentrating, the veins on his hand looked like they were about to burst. Before he completed this technique, he opened up his eyes and shouted, "If you don't want to die, then dodge it to the side." Armand's booming voice traveled towards the two sprinting men that could not help but notice him in the distance. It was just in time to see him throwing his large fist forward. Following this, they saw something strange. They could hear something similar to a thunderclap. Suddenly giant tiger head emerged before them and traveled their way. It caused the ground under it to crack and pushed everything to the side while increasing in speed. Roland could see Armand's strange pugilist skill approaching. It carried a wave of strange non-magical energy that was on par with a high-level Tier 2 attack spell. He quickly moved to one side while Robert did the same. Even when this attack passed by them, he could feel the wind pressure making his whole damaged armor rattle. He was almost pushed to the side by the residual wind pressure while Agni was luckily spared from it as he used his master as a shield. Without looking back, he continued to sprint as he realized what was the purpose of this attack. Robert on the other hand did a quick glance back, just in time to see the tiger head colliding with the mass of lava and pushing it back. A giant explosion rocked the lava lake as the attack connected with the heavy mass of molten rock. This technique was strong enough to blast a large hole in the lake and also gave Robert and Roland precious time to escape, while getting some of their clothes singed by the splashing molten lava. With one last long jump, they managed to get to the other side. Roland had to grab Agni by the collar and throw him towards the exit while almost getting his feet burned. Luckily he still had his fire-resistant boots on, so his feet didn't melt on the spot. He ended up rolling on the ground while trying to remove the boots that had lava stuck to them. With a little help from Lucille and a simple water spell, they were able to douse the fire. "Wayland, how did you end up in the middle of that lava lake? Weren't you stuck in that cavern?" Lobelia popped her head out from behind Armand. Her older brother looked a bit gassed after using that strange skill, but that didn't keep his sister from shoving him to the side to get the scoop. It's a long story, we are tired, I need to rest." Roland was not really in the mood to talk about what transpired in the caverns below. The armor that he was wearing, or at least what was left from it, told part of the story. After getting through the boss chamber, they were rewarded by another array of dim-lit tunnels. There were many monsters there that started out from level 80 and down. It was just as he had theorized before, he had opened up the back entrance to a hidden section of the dungeon. The sword-tailed boss was clearly a bonus section that would reward people with some good gear. While they continued to travel, they encountered weaker and weaker monsters. Traps and fake passages that made them go around in circles were something they got used to after a couple more days down there. Then they finally arrived into a larger section. There were stairs going up and another runic lock that he was able to open. Considering it opened up a hole in the molten lake while it was empty from the lava, they could consider themselves lucky. Otherwise, they would have flooded the chamber below, then either died or got stuck. This part of the dungeon was clearly designed to be entered after the lake cleared itself out. Without that knowledge, it would be very deadly to exit. Knowing this, a party could easily get something to detect if the coast above was clear before going back out. Now he knew, so if he ever decided to go to that pocket with the precious metals, he would be sure to create a device that was able to detect the lava. It would probably take a while before he got back there. He was not capable of defeating that monster by himself. The spot where he nabbed the Ethereum ore might have actually been able to replenish itself with time. This meant that if he managed to create a transport route for himself, he would be rich. He could sell the metals and crystals or use them for fuel. Even though he had his wind generators, they lacked portability. He had not been able to develop a working battery, yet with that pocket of crystallized mana fluid, he would be able to power items outside his workshop. After resting for a moment, he finally got his sari behind in gear. After standing up, the first thing that he saw was a smirking Armand. He was puffing out his chest like he was some kind of hero. Roland already knew what the man wanted from him, but the cocky attitude only made Roland incapable of thanking him. "Why so quiet? Don't you have something to say to your benefactor?" He was actually willing to tell him that he did a good job, but after the conceited tone, he changed his mind and a sigh escaped from his mouth. "I don't think we'll ever get along, now move out of my way." "What's with that attitude? I saved your life." Yeah, wish you saved some brain cells while you were at it." After spending a week down in the dark, Roland was quite done with this dungeon. He just wanted to get out of here and take a cold bath. Giving a thank you to Armand was the least of his concern. "Why, you little? Stop shouting, you big idiot, can't you see that they are injured?" Lobelia finally spoke up. She could clearly see that Roland's stance was shaky and that Robert had passed out after carrying Lucille in his hands for the whole run. "We need to get Sister Kasia here." Armand begrudgingly stopped yelling after looking at the beat-up group before him. It seemed like they needed to either get them to the night encampment or escort them out of the dungeon. Chapter 128, Time to Return. "Lucille, you are alive." "Please calm down, Charlene, I'm fine." A smiling blue-haired noble lady was being hugged by a young blonde girl that went by the name Charlene. The two friends were now back together. The first thing this young earth mage did was toss herself at the ice mage's dirt-covered body. The other people around them were a bit surprised by the unlady way of acting. Most of the time Charlene was composed and acted as a proper noble lady of her status. Now, on the other hand, she was even sobbing slightly. Did those two have such a relationship with each other? Roland had to take a step back after watching the two girls hug it out. He had come across this Charlene person before. From his point of view, the girl was more in line with all the haughty nobles that he knew. Whenever she spotted him talking about runes with Lucille, she gave him that look. One that told him that he shouldn't associate with one of her friends. Most nobles did feel like the commoners were below them in any way, shape or form. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary, as he was just not considered part of their group. People tended to create their own small or big cliques. If someone wasn't part of them, then they didn't belong. This was the same for these nobles. Only when accepted as part of their prestigious group they would start treating someone as a proper human being. They were now all gathered outside the lake area. The mountain goat beastmen were tasked to go grab the knights. With Roland, Robert, and Lucille being exhausted from the trip, they were in no condition to make it over the lake again. The knights had used the planned encampment and continued with their test even when Lucille was trapped. It seemed that accidents like this were somewhat included in the whole expedition. Losing one of the mages was not apparently a big enough reason to not get a passing grade. Now Roland was curious if they would not get any demerits, as the three people that fell down were able to return on their own accord. This depended on the instructor who was watching over this whole fiasco. He might even want to sweep it under the rug, as he was not able to react in time to save a viscount's daughter either. "Knight Robert, please give me an explanation. How were you able to return here?" The loud voice of Lord Percival moved Roland's attention away from the two young girls hugging each other. Robert and him had already drunk some healing and stamina potions, all given to them by Lobelia. Roland felt a bit ticked off by the tone of voice this noble was using. It was clear that he didn't think much of Robert, as he did not use this harsh way of speaking when talking to either of the noble ladies. Robert's facial expression, that had gone milder after their experiences down in the dungeon, reverted to its old stiff shape. His eyebrows went at an angle and he stood up straight while doing the usual knightly salute. The perfect knight that was starting to show some human traits was back to his old self, or at least that's how it seemed. Roland's only worry was him disclosing their run-in with the dangerous boss monster. He had given them the option of backing out, but not like a noble would see it like that. Roland could be held accountable for endangering nobles. This could bring various troubles his way, which he would like to avoid at all cost. Yes, Commander, I will make my report now. Hey! While standing up straight, Robert's eyes moved to the side and Roland could see him glancing at him for just a second. This took him a bit by surprise, but after Robert started to speak out he realized why he was looking his way. After being trapped in the cave, we discovered a passage that led us to a series of corridors. With Wayland's help Wayland. Not the adventurer. It felt like Robert was finally treating him like a proper person. Before the fall he mostly referred to him as adventurer. Roland continued to listen to this explanation, and to his surprise, any information about the room filled with metals in the boss chamber was kept out of it. Robert even downplayed the number of monsters they needed to face after leaving the boss chamber. The report that he gave informed Percival that they just found a series of underground corridors filled with bug-type monsters. Then at the end, they found an opening that led them to the middle of the lake. An exit from the tunnels. Yes, my lord, but after the lava flooded, I fear that the entrance has been sealed. This was another lie. After they went outside, the pathway closed itself automatically. Robert made it sound like the mechanism was a one-way exit. Good at ease. Percival nodded with his head. He was not an adventurer, so he was not that interested if there were any treasures below the dungeon. He was more concerned about passing this mission and not having a precious noble lady that also possessed a rare class to die on his watch. Roland wasn't sure what to say. He wanted to thank his half-brother for keeping it a secret. Before he could do that, a certain nun from the Sun Church appeared before him. Her hands were already glowing with the holy light. Mr. Wayland, please don't move, I'll heal your wounds. A miracle of healing appeared before him. Sister Kash's hands glowed in golden light. When this light touched his skin, he could feel a tingling feeling wash over him. He had drunk a healing potion beforehand, but healing spells were slightly different. They worked instantly. A Tier 3 priest could even recover lost limbs if their magic was high enough. There were even some rumors that Tier 4 healing classes were able to resurrect people with a loss to their experience and some memory loss. If those rumors were true or not was hard to confirm. Tier 4 healers were all candidates for the Pope position. It was a somewhat special class at Tier 5 that could be used only by one person per church. This left all the main churches with one pope, and only when they died would another pope be chosen. Roland wasn't aware of how this all worked, but the rumors said that the gods from these churches were involved in it. Thus getting a Tier 4 healer in motion would require a lot of capital and power. Probably only high aristocrats of the Duke caliber and above could move someone like that into action. While the nobles were busy with Robert and Lucille, Roland was able to catch up with his adventurer group. You've seen better days, at least you can just repair that armor of yours. Lobelia was the first one to speak up, while Silvio moved in from the side and gave Roland a pat on the back. Good job, glad that you were able to make it out alive. You're tough for human, next time no slip. Korgak chimed in with a one-liner. Then for some reason, after seeing Silvio patting Roland's back, he decided to come over and give one of his own. The half-orc was much larger than the trackers, so his pat was a full-time smack to his back plate. The already damaged armor rattled slightly while Roland had to take a step forward. Mr. Korgak, please be more gentle. Mr. Wayland has been through a lot. He must drink a lot of water and rest. Sister Kasha shook her head at the large half-orc that somewhat dropped his head down. He was not sure what happened during the stay at the camp, but he seemed to be afraid of her. Now then, Mr. Wayland, let me recite a passage of our holy gospel while you recover. Roland's mostly neutral-looking face that was still covered by the helmet showed a frown. It seemed that this was the problem, as the moment the gospel was mentioned the other party members started inching away from the nun. I think I'll pass. Roland sidestepped Sister Kasha while she was reciting some strange passages from their version of the Bible. Lobelia and Armand also cleared out from around them while the cleric continued her speech. It seemed that she really let them hear it during the camp stay when he was done. After going through some awkward pleasantries with his party members, Roland headed over to Silvio. The party leader was glancing at the nobles that were in the process of looking over their own comrades. Lucille was the center of attention, but even Robert was greeted by the other knights. After spending some time with the two, he started thinking slightly differently about nobles. He was still convinced that the exception does not make the rule and that most nobles were still less than pleasant to be around. Silvio nodded at Roland while looking over his damaged armor but not commenting on it. "Will we be returning now?" Roland didn't beat around the bush with his question. He was tired and his armor was rendered useless. After going through a couple of runic mending skills, it barely was able to produce defensive spells. All of the mana stones had been broken during the scuffle with the boss and he just wanted to go home. "That depends on them. We are still contractually obligated to stay with them. The one that makes the decision is that High Knight." Silvio motioned with his chin towards the older armored knight. This was the academy instructor that they came with and he would decide if this was over. The time they spent down here was over 2 weeks and they would probably need a day or two to get back. "Sir Bertold, this won't do. We must return this instant. There isn't even that much time left for the test. Lucille has been through enough to think she proved that she can handle herself here." Roland perked up as the blonde-haired noble lady started shouting. After she was done hugging Lucille, she strutted over to the High Knight instructor by the name of Bertold. The old knight in question looked slightly troubled by this request. He was probably weighing the pros and cons of this decision. Finally, after a moment of silence, he spoke out. "Lady Charlene, I would normally be inclined to let you off, but rules are rules." At first, the blonde lady started to smile, but her facial expression changed to a pout. Both she and also Percival were now talking with the High Knight. "But Sir Bertold, Now young lady, let me finish. This exercise was supposed to take a minimum of 3 weeks and we are a few days short. May I propose a small compromise?" The voices of the group of nobles started to become more silent as they discussed something with each other. From what Roland could tell, it was a positive proposition as the blonde lady's pout turned to a big bright smile. "They decided on something. I guess we are packing up," Silvio commented while covering a smirk with his hand. Due to his enhanced hearing, he could clearly hear what the nobles were discussing even though they were standing far away. Soon everyone else was clued in by the Knight Commander, Lord Percival. "Listen up everyone, we will return to our encampment." The first sentence didn't sound right, but soon Roland knew why Silvio was smiling. "Only half of our force will come with me while the rest remains with Lady Charlene and Lucille. We will only be returning to take the magic tents and the remaining provisions." From the order, it looked like they would be taking a smaller force to clear out the camp from what was left there. After hearing that Lucille was alive and well, half of them moved here while some people remained at the old encampment. "We will then meet up with the adventurer party before the boss chamber and then head up to the city where we will stay for the remainder of the week." "Oh! Aren't you glad, Wayland? Just relax, you'll be home soon enough. Isn't it great to have that Percival fellow on our side?" He gave that old knight an offer that he couldn't refuse. "An offer?" Roland asked while not really sure of what Silvio was talking about. He did not hear any part of the conversation, but not like he was listening to the nobles from the start. Silvio on the other hand was quite sneaky about it. "Use your imagination, what could an old knight like that be looking for at this point in his life?" Silvio gave him another pat on the back while moving out to do a sweep of the area. He left Roland with more questions without explaining much, but he got the gist of it. The Tier 3 knight was already past his prime. This could mean that he was looking for a place to retire. Percival belonged to a count's estate, he might even be the heir of the whole estate. With a few good words here and there he could propose a position at the count's side, maybe even let the Tier 3 knight become some kind of commander there. If it's like that, then maybe. The nobles were to return outside of this dungeon, but they would stay in the city for longer. It would look like the knights stayed for 3 weeks down in the dungeon, which would allow them to pass their test while also looking less suspicious when they returned. It seemed nice to have connections with high nobles, but why Percival used this card remained unknown to him. It didn't seem as if he would have failed. Either way, was he really just being cordial towards the tired Lucille? If Roland had to be truly honest, he thought this was the wrong decision. This only showed the young nobles that if someone had connections they could get away with murder. Even though they were trying to keep it hidden, probably some of the knights knew what was going on. Something like this would certainly not go down well during an actual war. While shaking his head about this deal, the rest of the people started moving. He was now separated from his two old companions while Agni remained. His ruby wolf had actually leveled up quite a bit thanks to the boss fight and then the many monster encounters after it. He would probably be evolving soon as he was already level 46 at this point. Woof! Tamed beasts have it easy. Roland patted the wolf on the head while grumbling that Agni had it too easy while leveling up. Even with his debugging skill he wasn't this fast. Let us head out. The knights seemed a lot more coordinated after the 2 weeks of being here. Now without the two slow mages in the party, they were even able to get through the lake in one piece. While walking he could only think about it finally being over and that his identity was safely kept hidden away. He had to commend himself on adding a few more attachments to this helmet and having Bernier almost welded in place. The helmet visor that he was using was also slightly different, and even when he opened it up, the top part of his face was covered. He had enough space to get food into his mouth without Robert noticing anything. Sometime later they arrived at the boss room exit. They had to make a temporary encampment there while waiting for the second part of the knights. They needed to spend one more day here till they moved back up. He noticed Robert and Lucille glancing his way from time to time, but now he was back to his old party. The adventurers had their own encampment while the nobles spent the time together. After not having much sleep for almost a whole week, he retired to his tent that he had to mostly set himself yet again. Armand had gotten the hang of setting these up, so he would not stay awake for that part. Even while being stuck with the talkative sister Kasia in his room, he managed to fall asleep rather quickly. Unbeknownst to him, the woman prattled on for hours as due to his helmet she couldn't tell that he was dozing off. The rest went well and without a hitch. The High Knight and Percival returned without getting ambushed by over-leveled monsters, and they all headed up. All of the knights had leveled up while fighting the Tier 2 monsters in the lower levels, so they had no problem with these Tier 1 variants. Finally, I'm out. I'm not going into this stinky dungeon for at least another month. Lobelia sprinted up the dungeon stairs and was the first one outside. The other adventurers were quite interested in the large party of knights and adventurers that were coming out. There was one person in particular that stood up. The beat-up armor was making a lot of noise and it looked like it was going to fall apart at any minute. It was finally over. Roland could feel the clear air and even see the sunlight shining down into his visor. He had made it out in one piece and had gained a lot while doing it. What remained to do was to return home and count the coins. Chapter 129 Back Home. Woof! You sure are excited, aren't you, boy? Agni wiggled his ruby-tipped tail while running in front of his master. They were on the path towards his house. He had taken it multiple times since he had come here and it was slowly taking shape. Roland didn't bother returning to Albrook City, for now, he needed to replace his armor before it totally fell apart. It was a miracle that he could keep his identity hidden away without his helmet falling off. All the rattling brought quite a bit of attention and he knew that people were looking at him. Everyone was probably wondering why he didn't take the armor off as they were already out of danger. Luckily the nobles didn't say anything and his party members stopped prodding after a while. After coming out of the dungeon the adventurers went their own way. Silvio informed him that he would make a report while they could take a break. They were to meet up at the guild the next day to get their cut. He also informed Roland that he would probably be asked about his little cliff accident. Robert, Lucille along with Percival and Charlene headed to the city and the mayor's house. His older brother didn't get a chance to say goodbye as he was forced back into his old position by Percival. The noble commander didn't care for pleasantries and he also didn't seem interested in having a chat with the adventurers. Roland didn't really mind, he just wanted to get this expedition behind him. The contract that he signed stated that after they left the dungeon, he was free to do what he wanted. He wouldn't even need to do a proper report, he was not compelled to. Due to this, he planned to not disclose the boss chamber or what was beyond it. Without getting a person that could feel out the runes and crack them, there was no way of entering the caverns. It was also in the middle of that lava lake, which would be a hard obstacle to pass. Not like I can get back there in this state. That monster will probably appear again, or maybe something even more dangerous. Roland gave out a sigh while thinking about the large cave with all those resources. He wanted nothing more than to just repair his armor and get back in there with Bernier. With a large enough spatial bag and some mining tools, he would become rich. The problem was the boss monster along with the monsters guarding the boss chamber. He would need to get past them without much help. Bernier wasn't really a fighter, and the only thing he could use would be runic ammunition. Even with the runic grenade launcher, he felt that Bernier would be more of a hindrance. That monster was intelligent enough to release an area of attack to trap Robert and Lucille. He would probably go for the weakest link, which would force Roland to defend Bernier. Regretfully, he would need to postpone the mining expedition for another time. First, he needed to upgrade his armor and restock on his runic ammunition. He felt like waiting till he was at least at the 100th level wasn't such a bad idea. This was fine, as he would have things to keep himself busy. By having this mission end, he would be getting those crafting secrets. The inferior build that required him to place mana stones on the exterior of his armor would not hold him back anymore. During this dungeon run, it became clear that having mana stones attached to his wares would hold him back. Perhaps shields were the only items that could use the old crafting process, as he could stack many mana stones on the inside of them. I'll have to make a new smelter and then try mixing some batches of metals. The Ethereum that I managed to take should be enough for one set of armor, should I make it from deep silver this time. Roland thought while now being almost at his home. He had a couple of bars of deep silver which he could melt. This was not quite enough for a full set of armor, but he could just get more at the market. This fantasy metal would allow him to keep the resistance of deep steel, but would also give him a buff against demons and undead type creatures. It was something that paladin classes liked to utilize, as it helped in resisting curse type spells. Wished I had a runic shovel. Hey! His train of thought was broken after he heard Bernier's voice from afar. He was close to his home, but not that close. This meant that Bernier was still in the forest area. The closer he got, the more he heard the sound of digging. Woof! Agni ran forward and started acting more as a dog than a wolf as he barked at the half-dwarven assistant. What? Agni, is that you? What are you doing here? The ruby wolf jumped on the red-haired Bernier and took him down to the ground. He started licking his face while wagging his tail. Roland peeked out from around a tree while moving forward. He grasped his damaged helmet and started pulling it off. What he saw was his assistant digging up a large hole. Next to this hole were 4 sacks that were tied around the top. Even without asking, he could tell what was in there. The flies that were circling around the dark dried blood made things clear. What are you doing, Bernier? Roland called out while Bernier managed to finally push Agni away. Bernier had a confused look on his face, and it seemed that he needed a few seconds to process this situation. Boss, you are back? Why are you back so soon? I thought you would be in the dungeon for at least another week. That's not the problem here. Why are you burying bodies so close to my house? Roland pointed to the obvious remains in the tied sacks. This made Bernier look like some serial killer getting rid of the evidence. The grave was still shallow, so it seemed that he just got here. Oh, these 4 chumps? Haha, you won't believe me when I tell you. Chumps, hey. Roland raised an eyebrow. It didn't seem that Bernier was perturbed by the fact that he was digging a grave for 4 bodies. This made Roland think that their deaths were justified in some way or another. If not, then maybe his assistant had a screw loose. Listen, boss. I'm listening. A few days ago, these 4 idiots tried to rob us blind. Oh, did they? Roland listened to Bernier's explanation about the home invasion that he wasn't part of. Bernier gave him a very colorful tale of a heroic blacksmith that battled 4 thieves with his bare hands. It was a hard-fought battle that he somehow managed to win while shedding blood to protect the new home he lived in. You broke the last one's neck with your hands alone, hey? Yes, boss. He almost got me when I was tired, but he didn't account for a blacksmith's strength. Roland just gave out a sigh while moving closer. This doesn't explain why you are burying them in the woods. Ah well, I went to the city to report it to the guards, they came over to check it out but they didn't care, the bastards told me to just bury the bodies myself. Why do we pay taxes if those leeches can't even take care of thieves? It seemed that the guardsmen didn't care for the dead robbers. They did take their adventurer cards which the thieves possessed. They were apparently all low-leveled silver-ranked adventurers. Hehe, I was sure that they would do that, so don't worry boss, I grabbed anything that was worth something before I called the guards. Bernier gave Roland a thumbs up while grinning. He would need to check up on those items but he didn't expect anything besides some daggers and maybe silver coins. Couldn't just leave them in the backyard, they were starting to reek. Bernier decided to bury these 4 in the forest and not too close to the house. That was the right decision. Roland nodded as this did make sense. Normally the guards would need to hire an undertaker to come get the bodies. This of course cost the city some good coin, which probably made them leave it up to Bernier. The death was not inside of the city so they didn't care as much. Glad that we can always trust in the guards to avoid work. Roland didn't know what to say so he just started walking towards his home. I'll leave you to it then, I need to get some rest. Leave it to me boss, you can tell me about the expedition later but Bernier trailed off at the end of the sentence while also turning his face away from Roland. Something the matter? Oh nothing, rest well, I'll just dig up this grave. Okay then. Roland was too tired to prod his assistant for the strange behavior. Soon he would realize why Bernier was acting sheepish. The moment he opened up the door at his fence he saw it. The whole backyard looked like a blast zone. There were small and large holes everywhere. The grass that he grew to make it look somewhat presentable was all burned up. This made Roland realize what really transpired during the home invasion and how all of the traps must have gone off. There were also larger craters that probably came from the weapon that Bernier was handed. It was clear to him that his assistant exploded the attacker, this was probably why they were in tightly tied sacks. He could even see some patches of dried up blood and chunks of human meat that were not properly cleaned out. I need to come up with something better than mines. By some miracle the wind turbines were intact, some had some damage but they were in working condition. This could not be said for the wiring that was exposed to the elements. If Roland had gotten here back a week later then maybe Bernier would have enough time to clean this mess up. I'm home. Roland moved to his house, the building was standing with no visible damage. It seemed that Bernier was successful in defending it. The backyard could be repaired later, first he needed to sleep and get cleaned. While going in he tossed the miraculously intact helmet to the side. When this helmet collided with the floor the visor flew off and slid to the side. Following this, he started undoing the straps from his chest plate, pauldrons, and all the rest. Some even snapped loose almost instantly. It was clear to him that this piece of equipment was not usable anymore. This armor had been one of his first works as a proper runesmith. It served him well for many months but now it was time to retire it. The pieces of armor started littering the ground as Roland took them off. He was tired but even then he was unwilling to just leave this on the floor. While grumbling he picked the parts all up and descended into his workshop. The armor made it into the scrap box where he kept most of the pieces of metal that were cut up for later smelting. He did not have a replacement runic suit at the moment, at least not a full one. He had made some replacement gauntlets with which he could cast some spells but that was it. After being free of his old suit he felt a lot lighter, it was time to take a bath. Before leaving though he spotted a finished armor on display. It was not one that he made nor did he remember buying one either. Did Bernier make it? He gave it a quick examination and could see that it was all at the intermediate level and made from deep steel. It looks like it will fit me. Without any spares, this new set of armor would do nicely for when he needed to report to the city. He could use the spare gauntlets that already had the runes and he also could take a spare helmet. Roland still had to watch out for Robert as his brother and the rest of the nobles were staying in town for another week. He didn't need it to be combat ready, just so that it would cover his face. Even though his brother seemed to have mellowed out with age, he wasn't sure how he would react if he knew Wayland the runesmith was his lost younger brother. It's almost over, they will be gone from here in a week. While heading back up, Roland thought about tomorrow. He needed to pay the Adventurers Guild a visit. Silvio would be there to make the report, but he needed to get what he was promised from the guild master. With that in mind, he prepared his bath. Even though he looked to be doing okay from the outside, he was really tired. While being down in the tunnels he didn't get any sleep, and even after getting out he was only able to take a small nap before they left. Now, while being submerged in his tub, he glanced at his status screen. His levels had gone up after killing all those monsters and that boss. Name: Roland Arden, L85. Classes: T2 Runesmith Lord, L10 Primary. T1 Mage, L25 Secondary. T1 Runic Mana Scribe, L25X. T1 Runic Blacksmith, L25 Tertiary. HP: 3024/3024. MP: 8141/8141. SP: 2082/4082. Strength: 81. Agility: 58. Dexterity: 110. Vitality: 81. Endurance: 90. Intelligence: 142. Willpower: 129. Charisma: 17. Luck: 10. Roland glanced at his mana numbers as well as his stamina numbers. The more he looked at them, the more he thought that the class that he received was a cheat. Even if Robert caught up in levels with him, he felt like he would be physically stronger than him even without the armor. Robert's class gained strength, vitality, and endurance somewhat equally, but even with that, it couldn't go against the Lord class 2-time multiplier. I wonder if other people have this class variant. Roland closed his eyes and started thinking. He was probably not the only one with a class like this, there were probably also variations of this class at Tier 3. What would be the multiplier then? 4 or 5? Would he be able to also get a prestige class when the time came, and would it force him into another troublesome trial? His thoughts started becoming hazy, but then drifted towards a new skill that he had learned after attaining the 10th level of Runesmith Lord. Basic Rune Overload. Skill: allows the runesmith to boost the power of a runic spell temporarily. There is a chance of the rune breaking when this skill is used. The higher the rune's grade, the lesser the chance of the rune structure collapsing. He didn't get to test it as he feared that his armor would get damaged too much. He already used his runic mending skill a couple of times, and at the end, all of his runic gear fell to a level below intermediate. I'll test it out tomorrow. Hey boss, are you here? I took care of the bodies, but I'm sure you've seen the backyard. I didn't have time to. Bernier returned to the house after an hour of digging. His digging skill was quite high, so he was able to finish up quite fast. He wanted to apologize for how he didn't have time to get the backyard in better shape, but before he could, he saw something interesting. In front of the door to the bathroom, he spotted a dark crimson ball of fluff. This was Agni, curled up and sleeping as if he was guarding the entrance to where his master was in. Did he fall asleep in the tub again? Bit early for that. The sun was going down, but it was not yet dark outside, so Bernier was a bit confused. Then he realized that Roland had just come back from a long dungeon expedition and was probably tired. With that in mind, he decided to remove himself from the house. This was not the first time his boss had fallen asleep in that bathroom, and most of the time he woke up during the night and found his way back to his bedroom. I guess I can try fixing those wires. Where was that magic dark liquid again? Bernier whistled to himself while closing the door to Roland's house. While his boss was resting, he would do some work and then follow it up with a nice drink. Chapter 130: Getting his cut. Ugh. A somewhat wrinkled Roland moved out of the bathroom. It was about 7 in the morning and he had stayed inside the tub filled with water for the entire night. His body was kind of aching after resting against the metal tub that was clearly not meant for sleeping. I need to stop sleeping in that thing. Roland twitched a bit after feeling something press against the rear side of his knee. Agni was there to greet him, which almost caused him to tumble forward. Good morning, Agni. Woof. With only a tower around his waist, Roland moved towards his bedroom to get dressed. After finding a plain white shirt and some pants, he was ready to eat something. After looking inside the refrigerator, he luckily found it restocked. There was some cheese, eggs, and even meat in the form of sausages. There was also no lack of beer in here that Bernier was sure to buy. Here, your share, you've earned it. Agni got a little pat on the head and also a bowl filled with meat. He had saved his hide back there in the monster chamber, which Roland would never forget. Roland started eating. The dried provisions that he had at the dungeon ran out quite fast. Afterward, he was stuck eating grilled monster meat, which got quite boring after 2 days. He wanted to relax and go to one of the more famous Albrook restaurants, but that would have to wait. The guild owed him some money and crafting knowledge. The guild master stated that he would have everything ready when he returned. This is the last time. Again he was consumed by greed and fear. The only reason he took this job offer was that he didn't want to wait. With his profession, he would be able to make money even with the monostone variant of the runic items. With time he would have a chance to get that knowledge himself. He could even try going to different cities and hire some bodyguards with enough money. Yet he got scared of people moving in the background. There were the cultists and the assassin hired by someone from the Arden estate. Roland found it hard to relax, so he risked it all to get his hands on items that would help him build up his power. He was successful this time around, but he could have very well just fallen to his death during that volcanic worm event. It didn't seem that his family was aware of his existence, even his older brother didn't notice that it was him. After so many years had passed, he didn't think that anyone was looking for him anymore. That would still leave him with the cultists, which were probably a more realistic adversary. Yet he didn't think they would bother sending anyone too powerful to find a young blacksmith. They probably never looked into his identity and were forced out of the city rather fast. It was more believable that they focused their eyes on his previous gnome boss and his tier 3 bodyguards that fled the city around the same time as he did. It was hard to relax for someone like Roland that was trapped in his own mind. Only when he gained enough strength to face someone at the level of those cultists, he would not be able to relax fully. With that in mind, he was already planning his next move, which was a golem. After going through some of the runic theory books that Lucille lent him, he was closer to achieving this. He had also nabbed a nice big Elocan crystal that could be used as a power source. With it, this automaton could move around freely. Still, this was a finite power source that could not be replenished. He was hoping to design a sort of runic battery that could be recharged with his wind turbines. For now, he had a lesser prototype that could store an excess, but it was not portable enough to insert into a human-sized golem. The easiest way would be to use some wires, but this would be an easy target for any opponent this golem faced. Good morning, boss. Roland's thoughts came to a halt after his assistant appeared. Bernier looked somewhat different than before, as if he matured slightly. The little scuffle with the thieves had apparently given the half-dwarf some confidence. Gee, morning, I've seen that you have been busy. That armor isn't bad. So you've seen it. Wanted to give you a surprise, but then those thieving bastards appeared. Yes, I've seen the backyard. Didn't know your punches could produce holes that big. Maybe you should become a pugilist instead. Roland smiled while Bernier turned his head to the side. His previous retelling stated that he battled the four with his bare hands, but Roland obviously knew that that wasn't true. So, how was the weapon I gave you? Ah, the runic launcher? It was great, but the reloading mechanism could use some work. Roland rubbed his chin while Bernier told him the real story. He described how he fumbled during the reloading procedure and almost died. The weapon is meant more for ranged support. Maybe a sidearm would do the trick. Instead of improving on the reloading mechanism, Roland contemplated creating a smaller backup weapon. Something closer to a regular handgun that people without combat classes could somewhat utilize. As before, instead of gunpowder runes would be used, the biggest problem would be the ammunition. He was not able to condense the runes into something small like a bullet. This would mean that for now, the bullets would just be regular bullets. A regular gun was still a good weapon for someone without any skills. A powerful archer would still be better with a bow, and all the skills made them even deadlier than a modern-day sniper. This would be only a backup weapon meant for more of a surprise attack. Without knowing what to expect, the enemies would not be able to react to a bullet in time. The problem would be the design. Nothing like a revolver existed in this world. On the other hand, something like a musket wouldn't be hard. A small explosion rune or a pressurized wind rune would push the bullet outside. The reloading would be faster than a regular musket, as the person would not need to shove gunpowder into the muzzle. Instead, they could just insert a round bullet and then instantly take aim. A smaller handheld version could also be made before he figured out how to create a proper runic revolver. So that's what happened. Good job. No need to thank me, boss. I'm sure the news spread through those thief guild circles. They will probably think twice before trying something like that again. Bernier commented while Roland nodded. He would also start working for the Adventurers Guild from this day forth. They would probably think twice before attacking someone affiliated with a giant organization as the Adventurers Guild. The possibility of getting robbed while they left on business was always there. Roland would need to prepare more defenses while also thinking about hiring some muscle from the guild. Just like any other merchant, he needed some help. For now, he didn't quite have the money to get himself competent protection. The most he could hope for is silver or maybe one gold-ranking adventurer. After having his breakfast and discussing some things with Bernier, Roland descended into his workshop. The armor was put on and his face was hidden yet again. This suit of armor looked a bit strange, as the parts on the arms didn't match the rest of the set and were also in red color. This will have to do. I didn't think you'd wear it yourself, boss. Isn't it a bit tight? Bernier scratched his forehead while looking at Roland standing in the armor he made. He didn't show it, but he was quite happy that the item he made was already being used. It's fine, surprisingly fits well. Did you use one of the old schematics? Yes. Why do you ask, boss? I redid most of them to fit my size. Without knowing, Bernier apparently used one of the schematics that Roland previously customized for his own height. In reality, what Bernier was doing wasn't that profitable. Making a full set of armor required taking measurements of the person that would be using them. Roland was on the taller side, which would make this finished armor harder to sell. The best way to sell these was to make them at an average height so most men could use them. This is why Roland mostly only sold weapons, shields, and separate armor parts like gauntlets, arm guards, and shin protectors that could be used as replacements by almost anyone. He would need to talk with Bernier about these sorts of things in the future, as he did want to make more money. His assistant, on the other hand, had a less coin-focused mindset. He just wanted to craft items and have other people use them. Agni, stay here, I should be back in a few hours. Agni dropped his head a bit, but Bernier was quick to get his attention. While those two handled the backyard problem, he would go to the city. He was not in a hurry, so he just walked while taking in the sights. Good day, Mr. Wayland. He nodded at the guard that instantly let him through, even while keeping some other wanderers waiting. His fame was slowly growing. Being the only real runesmith in the city, he started to get some pull. Even now, after seeing the runic inscriptions on his arm guards, the people could tell that it was him. With his contract with the guild going into motion, he also would be getting free. He just hoped that no one would bother him at his home for custom wares. May the lady's blessing be upon you all. Before the Adventurers Guild, he witnessed a peculiar sight. It was Sister Kasia, all dressed up in a white nun's uniform with a golden sun pattern sewn in. She was not alone, as there were other members of the Sun Church with her. She was next to the Adventurers Guild, speaking out loudly. The adventurers could not evade her gaze, and almost everyone that got near got a little custom preach session. Glad that you made it, Wayland. Oh, hey there, Silvio. Silvio appeared from the side. He was wearing a large backpack and looked ready for another expedition. Was nice working with you. If you ever find yourself in Isgard, be sure to visit the guild. Think that cleric is staying here. Well, see ya around. Roland nodded while the party leader made his exit. It seemed that he had gotten his reward and completed his assignment. With nothing more to do, it was time for him to return to his own city. Isgard, hey. Isn't that the one closest to the super dungeon? Silvio was gone, but the nun remained. The church's presence in this city was low at the moment, but it seemed that this woman would try to change that. Even now he could see some people approaching her. Was it her beauty or charisma? He didn't know, but maybe soon the city would finally get its own grand cathedral. The tavern door swung open and he was greeted by some familiar faces. Elydia, with her resting secretary face, was giving some coins to an adventurer that finished his quest. Armand and Korgak were there drinking while his younger sister was shouting at him and complaining. It seemed that for once he was late to the party. Everyone looked to had already gotten their rewards and he was probably the only one left. Mr. Wayland, the guild master is waiting for you. While approaching the receptionists, Elydia called out to him. He looked at her and almost could spot a small smile that quickly vanished as she moved her attention back to the person at her counter. He was now more or less part of this guild. All of his items would be deposited here and sold at the stores affiliated with the guild. This was acceptable to him. He could earn more at the auction house, but the fees were much higher, which brought the all-around earning potential to around the same. There was also the guild master that promised him runic research. If he was able to procure the crafting knowledge now, he might be able to get some later. This time around he would not take any life-risking requests. At most he could fashion some custom items for some big hots. It felt a bit strange, but Roland started remembering his old job in Edelgard. The store he was working in was not as large as this guild, but it had a similar structure. Whenever the people saw him, they either greeted him or nodded their heads. It seemed that his runesmith title had already given him some respect from these guild workers. I'm coming in. Roland knocked on the door before opening them up. Inside he saw a grumpy-looking guild master. The muscular giant of the man looked somewhat tired, and it seemed that he had lost some weight. He was looking over some papers while not really paying attention to the man that just entered his office. Fuck. Before Roland could ask about his rewards, he heard the large man smack that large desk of his with all his might. Damn nobles making demands. Can you believe this? Ordhan looked up to a fully armored Roland that didn't reply. Not like he knew what to say. This guild master here was somewhat hard to talk to. They want us to clear up the best hotel in Albrook and get them a servant per person. Do those little shits want to be found out or not? The desk was slammed again. From what Roland knew, the nobles were supposed to keep a low profile and not stand out for the remainder of the week. They could not return to the academy before a certain point, as it would just show that they failed in their mission. Ah, it's you, Wayland. Ordhan finally moved his head up and noticed that it was not one of the usual workers but a certain runesmith. You probably came for your cut, good job. The large man smirked a bit while pointing with his finger to a sack on one of the bookshelves. Roland slowly walked up to it and grabbed it. Inside he found some books and money. That's the runic knowledge you wanted, and also a little bonus for keeping that last safe. I don't know how I would explain this to the Viscount. You saved my hide there, brat. Roland nodded while looking over the items. It seemed like everything that he wanted was indeed here. It's all here. Of course it is, I keep my promises. Don't forget that we have a contract now. Start sending those runic items when you can. Everything seems to be in order. I'll lead myself out then. The old man leaned back and gave out a sigh while waving his hand. Do you have to be so stiff all the time? Loosen up, kid. You won't find a nice girl if you're like that. Your looks are being wasted, and stop wearing that blasted armor everywhere. Okay. Roland just turned around without knowing how to reply. Now with the notes and some change, he was ready to give the new smelting process a try. First, he would need to digest the new knowledge and see if he had the materials to fashion it. This should not be a problem as the new runic forge would mostly look like the old one, just made in a specific way and with specific runes on it. With his debugging skill, it would be instantly upgraded into a high-quality tool that would probably last him for a while. The nobles were stuck in some hotel for now, but that was not his problem. His involvement with them was over, he could now take his sweet time in designing his new wares. Roland's most ambitious project would be on the way, something that would cement him as a proper runesmith. That was, to make a golem. After entering the large guild hall, he ignored all the adventurers and headed for the exit. It was finally over, with one push the door swung open and he was on the way back home. At least that is what he had hoped for, because as he was just about to leave he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Sir! Wayland!" He stopped in his tracks and slowly turned his head around in a sort of mechanical way. There he saw a familiar-looking blue-haired woman, with someone closely resembling his half-brother. "God damn it, what do those two want?"